Good evening. We're back with more Marvel Champions, and this evening will be a hero tier list. So first we'll go over what the criteria is that we're going to be using to judge the heroes as much as possible. Going to try to be objective. This will be a list of heroes that I believe are the most powerful. And the overall objective is to be able to give good recommendations to players who are thinking about buying additional content and are wanting to buy heroes that are capable of taking on the most content possible, particularly on Expert or Heroic 1 difficulty. I think we've all had the experience with card games of getting hyped up over new cards and then buying them and discovering they weren't quite as powerful as we were hoping. And that is unfortunate, especially if you are like a college student and don't have a lot of disposable income. That situation's happened to me plenty of times in Hearthstone, in Star Wars CCG, in Marvel Snap. So the goal of this hero tier list is to recommend heroes for players and decks that are going to be able to take on, if not all, then close to all of the content, and there will be a few that I can virtually guarantee can take on all of the content in the game on Expert difficulty. There's only a few that are capable of that, unfortunately. And then we'll go over, of course, the heroes that are capable of taking on some but not all, and so on down the list. The S plus tier will be reserved for heroes who have, at the least, completed a variety of scenarios on Heroic 1 difficulty, as well as Magneto, Venom Goblin, and Ronan the Accuser on Expert difficulty. The S tier heroes will be heroes that have completed at least one of the 3 most difficult scenarios in the game on Expert difficulty, as long as a wide variety of other content, but they won't be quite capable of taking on all of the content in the game. And we'll proceed down the list from there. A and B heroes will be above average, capable of doing a lot, but maybe not the most difficult scenarios. C tier heroes will be heroes that function, but I would consider to be more for fun or thematic purposes. And then D, or change this to F tier heroes, are going to be heroes with semi-broken mechanics. Now, one thing to note is that this is a hero tier list for true solo play. I can offer you not no recommendations, but only limited recommendations for multiplayer. These recommendations that I will give in the video are all for true solo play, as that is all I can guarantee, and for proof about heroes being able to take on very difficult content, I have gameplay videos for all of the heroes that are B tier or higher. I don't always have gameplay videos for C tier or lower heroes, except perhaps in the progression series. So, what are the things that we're looking for in a good hero in Marvel Champions? Well, the heroes that are going to go in the S plus tier all have a couple of things in common. Number 1, card draw. That's really important that a hero be able to draw cards beyond the standard 5 hand size. And the more cards, the better. The S tier heroes are going to be the S plus tier heroes are going to be heroes that are capable of having big turns. They don't have to have a big turn every turn, but they have to be capable of it from time to time. And by big turn, I mean they've got to be capable of drawing 3 extra cards or so, or possibly generating 2, 3, or 4 extra resources to pay for the cards that they have. And that isn't common. Not a lot of heroes can do that. That's why there aren't a lot of S plus tier heroes. Some heroes can come close. Some heroes can generate some card draw or resources beyond the standard, but not a lot more. And those are heroes that are generally going to fall in the A or B tiers, or possibly C, if they're more on the weaker side. So that's the first thing that we're looking for from a good hero, and that is, in my opinion, by far the most important thing. The second thing we're looking at is the strength of the hero's events. And by strength, I mean that the amount of power or the amount of damage that you can generate from a single event. The challenge in high difficulty content comes from a few different factors. But one of the factors is the retaliate trait. There are, well, at least Venom Goblin has retaliate, and Ronan the Accuser has retaliate as well. Two of the hardest villains in the game. So if you want your hero to be able to take on those challenges on expert difficulty, you need a way to deal with retaliate, and that's a problem for a lot of heroes because there are quite a lot of heroes who don't do burst damage very well, and their damage tends to be sustained over time. Lots of little attacks of 2 or so, or they rely on allies to do damage. And the retaliate damage stacks up with such heroes. It stacks up a lot, and then when you take too much retaliate damage, you're forced to flip to alter ego, and then the threat builds up against you, or the minions build up against you, or the attachments build up, and then you lose. You can't really flip to alter ego very often in true solo on high difficulty, or you will lose. You need to be pretty sustainable in hero mode. And so that's why one of the things we're looking for is high damage events, because that means that you can do a lot of damage while only taking 1 retaliate damage in return. In addition, we're typically looking to burst down phase 3, or stage 3 of the boss on high difficulty, because when you're playing on the maximum difficulty that your hero can handle, usually you're barely stable or just getting by on stage 2. And then maybe stage 3 is a little bit beyond you. So what you do is you use stage 2 to build up your board so that you can get through stage 3 as quickly as possible. That is most often how it goes when you're playing on high difficulty. That's usually the optimal strategy. Though not always. There's one hero in the game that can down very, very difficult content in a just kind of grind it out type manner, but that's because he is able to profit from retaliate, and we'll go over that hero later. So we're looking for resource generation, in particular card draw. We're looking for good damage from the events, and by good I mean preferably more than 8 damage for one event. If we have those two things, if we have card draw or resource generation, and we have high damage events, or other ways of dealing damage that are immune to retaliate are also acceptable. There are a few heroes that can deal sustained damage over time that doesn't proc retaliate because it doesn't have the attack listed on the card. It doesn't have attack listed on the card, so you can use those little 1 or 2 damage upgrades repeatedly every turn without worrying about retaliate. So we need either large burst damage or damage that's immune to retaliate, in addition to our card draw or resource generation. And if we got those two things, then we're looking at a very high tier hero, if not an S+ tier hero. There aren't many of those in the game. Now, the heroes that are going to be in CB or A tier, they're still capable of taking on a lot of content, particularly on standard difficulty where you run into retaliate less often. And many of them are going to be quite fun. I'll try to make a note of it when I find a hero fun, but fun isn't the standard that I'm going by. There will be heroes that some of you watching will not agree with my ranking of them. In particular, I would say probably specialist heroes. It's my opinion that defensive specialist heroes don't tend to play very well in true solo on high difficulty because defensive specialist heroes don't typically have access to any kind of burst damage. And so they tend to take a lot of damage from retaliate over time, and then they have to heal. And so it's not that they're bad, it's just that they're kind of built for multiplayer, right? They're built, defensive specialists, they're built to fulfill a role on a team. They're not really built for true solo. I wouldn't say that Marvel Champions is really geared for true solo in general. It's really built around a multiplayer team comp with like a defensive specialist hero, an offensive specialist hero, and You can play it true solo for sure, and you can beat all the content in the game with multiple heroes for sure. But there are definitely heroes that were built with an eye more toward multiplayer. Rogue in particular is a hero that's just partially non-functional when you're playing in true solo because her touched ability, you can't use it on yourself. And so that ability has benefits when it's attached to a hero, and since it can't attach to herself, if you're playing in true solo, you just can't use that aspect of her kit at all. In general, the X-Men cycle in particular seems built for team play. That being said, there are plenty of very strong heroes for true solo play. However, for those of you who play multiplayer all the time, the rankings for a few of the heroes may be a bit lower than you're expecting, and that will be because they're really built for multiplayer, at least in my opinion. So with that extended intro out of the way, let's dive in and get started. We're going to start in more or less release order. So we'll do the core box heroes first and then move on. And it won't be exactly in release order, but it'll be pretty close to it. Also, before we get started, we're going to add one more tier. Would like an S minus A plus type tier in between. So this will be S minus A plus. Alrighty, so let's dive in. First up, we're going to have Spider-Man. So Spider-Man's got the standard 5 hand size, but he does generate an additional card every time the villain initiates an attack against you, which is quite strong. His 1, 2, 3 and stats is pretty good. It lands him pretty squarely in the defensive specialist type category. In particular because of cards in his kit in particular because of backflip. When you would take any amount of damage from an attack, prevent all of that damage makes him one of the best defensive heroes in the game. Apart from his hero power, generating a card each time that the villain initiates an attack, he's pretty light on resource generation. He does have Web Shooter, which generates 3 resources at the cost of 1 resource plus this card, so it's +1 in resource generation, which is okay. And then he also is pretty light on threat removal. All he has is Spider Tracker, and that's kind of unwieldy to use. But because of backflip and because of that strong hero power, which helps him to generate a lot of extra cards, he's going right in that S minus A plus type tier. He's capable of taking on a lot. He's not really capable of taking on the big 3 on expert difficulty, at least not reliably. Now, when I say a hero isn't capable of that, it's simply in my experience, and also what I mean is that they're not capable of doing it more than 1 in 10 times. There are going to be heroes on this list that are capable of doing those challenges with a win rate of less than 1 in 10, so they'll be able to do it once in a blue moon, maybe with a perfect draw. But I'm looking for heroes that can defeat those challenges reliably in order to give them the seal of approval so that players will not experience any disappointment upon buying them, at least no disappointment in their power levels. They may still not be fun to play depending on a player's individual tastes, but at least their power level will be solid if you follow the tier list. So Spider-Man's falling in the S minus A plus category. He's very, very strong, and he can do a lot. And in particular, I think he is likely to get better in multiplayer because he is a defensive specialist. And if you compare him with a hero that does threat removal really well, then he's going to get even better than he is in solo. But he's quite good in solo, and there's a lot that he can do. I like this hero. Next up, we have Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel is really good. Now, I should note at this point that these hero rankings, they depend on the assumption that players are going to play the best possible deck for that hero. There are a few heroes that are quite bad unless you play a very specific deck for them, and then they become incredible. Captain Marvel, with just the core box, is okay. Spider-Man also greatly benefits from cards that are released after the core box. So if you've played Spider-Man using just the core box, you may be a little bit surprised at that ranking, because with just the core box, I really don't think he could be considered S- or A plus, because did struggle to take on some of the content in the core box with Spider-Man using only the core box cards. And Captain Marvel is pretty similar, but with additional cards later, she becomes incredible. In terms of her resource generation, one of the things that holds her back the most is that her alter ego is where a lot of her resource generating power lies. With that alter ego action, you can choose a player to draw one card, and that's very good. You also have the card Alpha Flight Station, which you can discard one card and then draw two if you're Carol Danvers, so that gets you an additional card. So she generates card draw reasonably well, but remember I mentioned that we're looking for heroes that can generate 3 or more in a turn for an S plus tier hero. However, the second criteria that we're looking for is burst damage event. She also has energy absorption for resource generation, which is a pretty nice card. So you put those things together and she's well above average in resource generation. And then you also have her energy channel, which allows you to charge up with energy resources, and then you can deal 2 damage per energy resource all at once to a maximum of 10. That allows you to deal 10 damage for one attack, and that isn't 10 damage it's not very cost efficient, because it costs you 5 resources plus this card in order to do that, but being able to deal 10 damage in one event means you can pretty effectively deal with retaliate damage, so Captain Marvel can do a lot. She's really, really good. I didn't find her capable of doing very well against Venom Goblin and Magneto, so, but she does well against Ronin. She's not a high win rate hero against Ronin on expert difficulty, but there is a burst down strategy that she has available to her against Ronin thanks to her energy channel, and I find her resource generation is just enough to deal with some very difficult scenarios, and she's a lot of fun to play as a burst damage hero, and likely in multiplayer be an excellent offensive specialist as well. She's going in the S tier. I think she's really, really good and capable of taking on a lot of content, though she does require that you build up your collection to take full advantage of her, because she needs those high quality energy resource cards in order to really maximize what she can do. Moving on, we'll take a look at She-Hulk. She-Hulk is not generally thought of as being very good, and that is an opinion that I agree with. You'll note on the hero card there it says hand size 4. Hand size 4 is an idea that, in my opinion, should not exist in Marvel Champions, and the reason is because it's very limiting to the player. Hand size 4 typically happens on heroes that are in the movies or in the comics strength-based heroes. They're going to be heroes like Hulk, She-Hulk, Colossus, Thor, and so forth, and I guess the developers didn't want them to be too powerful, so they limited their options to a hand size of 4. The problem is, card games, in my opinion, are at their best when players have a lot of options to choose from. Then there is a high skill ceiling for that card game, because when you have a lot of options to choose from, it increases the likelihood of choosing the wrong option, so to speak, or choosing an inefficient option. And also, it means that you will have available different combos, and if you spot the right combos, then you can accomplish more than players who aren't able to. But when you have a hand size of 4, typically there's only one play line available to you. Cards will usually, probably most often cost 2 or 3 resources, and when you have a hand size 4, you can really only play 1 card per round. And I don't think it's very fun, and it certainly isn't powerful. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that the thing we're looking for the most is resource generation, in particular card draw, but also resource generation, and starting out with the handicap of -1 in card draw is it turns out really, really bad, both in True Solo and just in general. She-Hulk does have a resource generating card in her kit, or a card draw card in her kit, which is Focused Rage. It does cost 3, and you have to take 1 damage to use it. For her event, her burst damage potential, she's got Ground Stomp. It can do a lot of damage, but only if you're at really low HP, so it's kind of unwieldy to use. It costs a lot of resources, and you only have 1 available in the deck. When you combine all those factors, and in addition, some of her other cards are borderline useless, if not completely useless. You'll never want to play them. You combine all these factors, this hero is going in the F tier. She's not good. She's not good. She's really bad. She's not really going to be taking on any high-level content reliably, in my opinion. Moving on, next up is going to be Iron Man. Well, Iron Man gets +1 hand size for each tech upgrade you control to a maximum hand size of 7. That's exceptional. +2 beyond the standard 5 is amazing when you get it set up. The issue is that he starts with a hand size of 1, and that's terrible, and when you're on a high level of difficulty, you really only have 1 or 2 turns to set up before you're going to get overwhelmed. And that's a struggle for Iron Man. Nonetheless, there are builds available to him where he can get set up really fast. And that means he's capable of doing a lot. He can take on a lot of content on expert difficulty. Not really any of the 3 most difficult villains in the game, but I have used him for entire campaigns on expert difficulty. In fact, I think I have a full campaign with Iron Man on expert difficulty using the protection aspect. Protection is typically his best aspect because it gives you access to additional tech upgrades. He really does need those tech upgrades that go beyond what the core set has to provide because they allow him to get set up faster, and that's really important for his kit, for taking advantage of that 7 hand size and not getting too limited by the 1 hand size. So to reach his full potential, yeah, he needs additional cards beyond what the core set has to offer for sure. And it needs to be centered around getting him those additional tech upgrades. He may be the only hero on this list who I think is... No, he's not the only one. I take that back. But he's one of the few that I think is really, really exceptional in protection on True Solo. And protection is exceptional for defensive heroes when you really need a defensive hero for your team. But in True Solo, it's got its problems, and among them being threat reduction and burst damage. However, Iron Man likes protection because it gives him access to some cheap tech upgrades that he can use to get set up in maybe 2, possibly 3 turns. But when he can do that, he's really, really strong. He can overcome the obstacles that kind of build up against you in the early game in the first turn or 2 while you're weak, and then he can get rolling and he can do a lot. He's got good burst damage with Supersonic Punch. Seen here, it's borderline. It's 8 damage for 1 event. 8 damage for 2 is very efficient. 8 damage for 1 event is right on the border of what we're looking for. When you combine it with Repulsor Blast, he can have some very big turns. He does take some retaliate damage doing it though. And his powered gauntlets, which deal 2 per turn, are labeled as an attack, so they do take retaliate damage. All things considered, he's going in the S-A+ tier along with Spider-Man. I do think he can do a little bit more than Spider-Man. Now, these heroes are all heroes that we all get in the core box, so players aren't really going to be making decisions about whether or not to pick up these heroes, but you may be making decisions about whether or not to build out the heroes, to acquire the cards that build the best deck possible that you can make for that hero. And so it's worth talking about what these heroes can do at their peak, because players may decide, you know what, I'm not gonna build out She-Hulk. Maybe there's cards that I could buy that would help her, but if her ceiling's really low, then maybe I don't want to do that, or maybe I just do it for fun, or so forth. So Captain Marvel, in my opinion, the best of the core set heroes after she's fully built out. Iron Man and Spider-Man are both capable of doing a lot, but they're not going to get into the S tier. To get in the S tier, a hero has to be capable of taking on at least 1 of the 3 most difficult villains in the game. with a reasonably high win rate, and Iron Man and Spider-Man can't really do that, but they can clear a lot of content on expert difficulty that's in the, like, if we were making a villain tier list in terms of their power, Iron Man and Spider-Man would be capable of taking on, like, I don't know, A tier heroes or so, or A tier villains, but maybe not the S tier villains. The S tier ones would be like Venom, Goblin, Magneto, Ronan, and so forth. But Iron Man is very, very good if you build him out, and he's relatively cheap to build out too. That is important to note. He's relatively affordable to make the best deck possible for him, and he gets better in multiplayer because in multiplayer you don't have to set up quite as quickly. You can have a friend who can cover your early game weakness and be fully built up by turn 2 or 3, and then you can really carry the game after that. Moving on, next up is Black Panther. Black Panther, I enjoyed playing him in multiplayer. I don't think he's very good in true solo. The reason is, well, he's got Retaliate, but he doesn't have any way to generate resources or card draw except for he starts with a Black Panther upgrade in his hand at the beginning of the game, but that means he doesn't have an alter ego ability for the entire rest of the game. And then he's got the Golden City that can draw 2 cards while he's in his alter ego, which would put him roughly equivalent to Captain Marvel, except Captain Marvel's card draw comes built in and doesn't require you to possibly cycle through your deck one full time before you get it. Captain Marvel can draw 1 card base and then 1 card with Alpha Flight Station, and she's also got her energy absorption, which generates 3 resources. Black Panther has a resource generator as well, but it's only 2. It's decent, but it's not really gonna elevate him the way that Captain Marvel's does, combined with her strong events. Black Panther doesn't have those strong events. He doesn't have burst damage potential, really, at all. His Wakanda Forever is his primary source of damage, I would say. And yeah, you can resolve all of your special abilities at once, but these really fall into the category of sustained damage because they're labeled as attacks, as you can see there. And when they're labeled as attacks, well, this one isn't, so that's nice, but being labeled as attacks means they're prone to retaliate. And in addition, to get these upgrades set up, you have to spend resources without getting anything for them immediately, and that is really bad in true solo. If you're going to play Black Panther, you really need teammates to cover you while you get your upgrades set up, or else you're just going to get steamrolled. He's going into the D tier category. He's not totally useless, he's not totally broken. He does at least have the hand size 5, and he's got the Golden City. But there's not much that this hero can do in true solo, at least on high difficulty. He's not very good. So that's all of the core box heroes, and we will move on and talk about the first wave heroes. First up is going to be Captain America. Captain America is a hero that I would put in the defensive specialist category, because he has the card Shield Block, which next to Backflip is probably the best defensive card in the game. He's a very thematic hero. I really like the way he was designed. His limitations, he doesn't have good resource generation. He doesn't have any way to draw cards. His resource generation is limited to 2 copies of Super Soldier Serum, and beyond that, he doesn't have any way to generate additional resources. And 2 copies of Super Soldier Serum puts him maybe a little bit above average in terms of resource generation, but not much. And he doesn't have any way to draw cards, so the strength of the hero is really in his defensive abilities. His Retaliate that you get from his shield, which starts in your opening hand. And he's also got 3 defense. He can ready multiple times. He can shield block. He can deal some damage back with his shield throw. He's got his Heroic Strike, which is 6 damage and a stun, and that stun is nice. If you run protection, there's kind of a stun lock build available to him, but stun lock falls apart a little bit when you play against a hero that has steady or stalwart, and as the game goes on, more and more villains have steady or stalwart, And these recommendations are, well, we want the heroes in the upper tiers to be capable of taking on as many villains as possible, as many different types of villains as possible. We don't want them to have glaring weaknesses. And running a stun lock build with Captain America, unfortunately, you will have a glaring weakness, which is steady or stalwart builds. So you combine those factors. He doesn't have burst damage. His heroic strike only deals 6 damage, so he tends to fall into the category of lots of little sources of damage all the time, which doesn't do well against retaliate. So when you got a hero that doesn't do that well against stalwart or steady, you got a hero that doesn't do that well against retaliate, but there is a lot that he can do. And so he's going in the A tier, in my opinion. Now, when he first came out, when I was playing through my progression series, we went from the core box to Captain America, and he felt overpowered. Because with just those cards available, the core set and Captain America's hero pack, he's way better than any of the core box heroes. But over time, 3 of them at least got much better than they were in the core box. They got significant upgrades, in my opinion. And Captain America never really got that much better. Iron Man got better because more tech upgrades were added. Spider-Man got better because more allies were added that could help him overcome his weakness for thwarting. And Captain Marvel got better because of the addition of lightning resources that were very strong cards in their own right. Captain America never really got any better than what he was, so he was initially, upon his release, seemingly overpowered and very, very strong relative to the core box heroes, but as the game progressed, 3 of them at least were able to surpass him, at least in my opinion, and he now finds himself above average and strong, but not in the same tier as Iron Man, Spider-Man, or Captain Marvel. Next up we have Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel's an interesting hero. She's got this response after you play an attack, thwart, or defense event, exhaust Miss Marvel and return that event to your hand. The issue is she's got very weak stats, and a lot of her abilities are tied up in her alter ego. So her kit has these alter ego action cards. Exhaust Amir Khan, place 1 card. You can, on the bottom of your deck, you can draw a card. They've got Bruno Corelli, who can store cards and then use them, or have them attached to your hand so you can build up and then have a huge turn. But the problem is you can only attach a card with your alter ego action. Reduce the cost of the next card you play this phase by 1. This means after you flip to her alter ego, she can have pretty big turns, but you do have to flip to her alter ego in order to do that. And that is not something we want to do in true solo. Heroes that really rely on their alter egos in order to reach their full potential, unless their alter ego really heals for a lot, that's not good. They're not going to do very well in true solo. They're really designed around flipping to alter ego and back fairly often, and in order to do that successfully on high difficulty, you really need a teammate to be able to cover your weakness. So with Miss Marvel, I found her pretty disappointing in solo. Pretty disappointing because of the weak stats, which gives her significant problems early. She's got 10 hit points, which is okay, but nothing exceptional. Now there are some pretty cool like OTK combos that you can do with her when you use Repurpose or something like that. It's a fun combo. It's not one that's easy to set up for high difficulty scenarios, and in fact I would go beyond that and say it's really difficult to set it up if you're playing high difficulty in true solo. So she's going in the D tier. I of course recognize that there are a lot of players that really like this hero and have a lot of fun with her, but we are keeping a pretty narrow focus with this tier list, and we're focusing on true solo and very high difficulty play, and Miss Marvel doesn't do that well in those circumstances because if she stays in hero form, she has no way to generate resources. Except one, I should say. There's one card in her kit that generates a resource for an event, and that's Biokinetic Polymer Suit, but that is below average as far as resource generation or card draw goes. In hero form, she can do it in alter ego, but that's unwieldy. It's hard to use in true solo play. really don't want to be in Alter Ego. There's only really one hero in the game, maybe two, where I feel okay switching to Alter Ego. With every other hero in True Solo, it's considered an emergency move and something that will, a lot of the time, lead to a loss straight away. So heroes that require you flipping to their Alter Ego to take full advantage of their kit are not ones that I would recommend or expect to beat a lot of content with when you're playing True Solo. Next up we have Thor. Well, Thor is another hand size 4 hero. He does have a way to get up to 5 with the card Asgard, which gives him +1 hand size. And then he has the ability, after you engage a minion, draw 2 cards. So he is able to do some things. For a hand size 4 hero, he's probably the best of the hand size 4 heroes, in my opinion, because of that draw 2 cards ability. But that's not good against every scenario, because not every scenario has a lot of minions that come out, and some of them have very few minions. And against those, Thor tends to be pretty anemic in terms of his resource generation. He's going in the D tier, which is going to be, well, higher than a lot, if not all, of the other hand size 4 heroes. And there is some things that he can do. Primarily, he's a minion specialist, so he's decent against villains that bring a lot of minions into play. And I think I was able in playtesting to beat something like Ultron on expert difficulty with him. Maybe he can do okay against something like Mutagen Formula. Maybe. That's a big maybe. I don't know that I'd expect anything more out of him than that. So he's a hero you'd buy and build out for a minion specialist, but even as a minion specialist, I'd probably recommend other heroes. So he's falling into the more fun or thematic category, at least for True Solo play. That hand size 4 is just too limiting. It's really, really limiting. And I do wish that it wasn't in the game. I don't think that I think that if every hand size 4 hero was suddenly increased to say hand size 5, I don't think that would break anything. To be honest, I think every hero that has hand size 4 would just get better with hand size 5 and be more playable, but I don't think any of them would be OP. We don't have enough heroes that can deal with all of the content in the game on expert difficulty, at least in True Solo. And so I wouldn't object to some heroes being buffed, and removing the hand size 4 in favor of hand size 5 would seem a very reasonable way to do that to me. But of course it isn't going to happen, and we're still seeing heroes come out with hand size 4 as recently as Colossus, and I think there's been at least one revealed that has hand size 4 for the next cycle. So it's not going anywhere, and it is pretty limiting for Thor. It's pretty limiting for every hero that's got it, so he's going in the D tier. Next up we have Black Widow. Black Widow is a hero that I liked a little bit in the progression series when played with the cards that were available at the time. She does have the ability to draw a card in Alter Ego ability when you play a preparation card. You're not always going to be taking advantage of that when you're in Alter Ego, but you will reasonably often. She's got her Black Widow's Gauntlets, which generate a wild resource for a preparation card, and then she's also got the kind of cool ability, or the cool card, Covert Ops, which can confuse the villain, and it's an action and not a hero action, so it can be used from Alter Ego, which gives her the ability to play from Alter Ego more so than other heroes, though that's not very effective in True Solo. And she doesn't really have any burst damage to speak of. She tends to be more a little pings of damage over time type of hero, and what that adds up to is not great in True Solo, unfortunately. She's a little bit above average in terms of the card draw, but really not much. The Black Widow's Gauntlets aren't really enough to do it in terms of elevating what she can do, and the ability that draws cards in her Alter Ego isn't always very consistent, and you do have to take advantage of, or you do have to flip to Alter Ego to take advantage of it. but her stats are decent with 222, so she's going in the C tier. There's nothing particularly broken about her kit, but in terms of separating herself from the pack via burst damage, via strong defensive abilities like Captain America or Spider-Man, via resource generation, she doesn't do enough to separate herself from the pack, so she's going into the C tier, in my opinion, for true solo play. That brings us to Doctor Strange. Well, this first cycle, heroes haven't been that much to speak of. We got 2 D tier heroes, a C tier, an A tier. Doctor Strange is S plus tier. Arguably the best hero in the game, though I would make the case for someone else. But I know a lot of players prefer Doctor Strange. He's got this special invocation deck, and in that invocation deck is the card Winds of Watum. Winds of Watum draws 3 cards for free, and then you also have the card Master of the Mystic Arts, which allows you to play the top card of your invocation deck. So you can have turns where you play Master of the Mystic Arts to proc Winds of Watum and draw 3, and then use Winds of Watum normally and draw 3 again. For turns where you draw 4 or sometimes 5 cards, if you find another Master of the Mystic Arts, that allows for some incredible cycle. You can use that to set up. Doctor Strange has his cloak, which allows him to ready up. He has a resource generator in the Eye of Agamemnon, I think it's called. No, not Agamemnon. The Eye of Agamotto generates resources with that. Then he also has access to the Sorcerer Supreme. Because he's a mystic character, he can get +1 hand size while in hero form with this basic card. That gives him a hand size of 6 plus access to the Mega Winds of Watum turns. Now he doesn't have that great a burst damage. He's got his Bands of Cyttorak, which is 7 damage, not really what we're looking for. It doesn't count as an attack though, so it is very helpful. However, I made the case in my Hero Spotlight series that the best way to use Doctor Strange is with a Dive Bomb deck combined with Honed Technique, and that does give him burst damage. So when you combine the Mega Winds of Watum turns and the Sorcerer Supreme with the Dive Bomb Honed Technique combo, you've got everything you could want in a hero. Doctor Strange is going in the S plus tier. I have zero problem recommending him to players that want one of the most powerful heroes in the game, because he is definitely that. And my personal recommendation is that you build out Dive Bomb Honed Technique. Doctor Strange, though I am sure that other players would have some pushback on that, but I do have videos of that deck on the channel against all 3 of the most difficult heroes in the game, and I can vouch for him beating a wide variety of Heroic 1 scenarios as well. So that's my personal preference for Doctor Strange, because it provides the burst damage that his kit lacks a little bit. Burst damage meaning damage that's immune to retaliate, and or damage where you can get 9+ from a single event. Dive Bomb gives 11 from a single Dive Bomb once you've got Honed Technique set up. So combined with Winds of Watum and Sorcerer Supreme, it gives him a lot of power. A lot of power. And in any case, he's going in the S plus tier for sure. And you can make a case for him being the best hero in the game, though my vote goes to someone else. But I really would be shocked to get any pushback about Doctor Strange being in the S plus tier. He is widely considered one of the best heroes in the game. Next up we have the final hero of the first cycle, and that is Hulk. Unfortunately, Hulk is not good, and you can really see most of what you need to know about Hulk right there on his hero card with the 4 hand size and the 0 thwart. Yikes. He does have 18 hit points, but he also discards your hand at the end of your turn. So the way that works is at the end of your turn you discard whatever cards you have in hand, and then you draw up to your hand size of 4. Hulk's kit is also pretty unique. He's got Hulk Smash, which gives you +10 attack for a basic attack for the cost of 3. He's got a readying ability, which also draws a card, but unfortunately really doesn't have any way to generate extra resources or cards. So he's actually -1 card, minus one card / resource from what the other heroes typically have. And with that 0 thwart, when you combine those two things, the strength of his events is okay, but he cannot make up for the extremely weak resource and card generation. Hulk is just not good, and he's going in the F or nearly completely broken tier, so I would not recommend him to anyone except for fun or thematic purposes. Next up we have Hawkeye. Well, Hawkeye is a bit fragile. He's got pretty weak stats. He has only 9 hit points. He's got a hand size of 5. In terms of generating additional resources or cards, he has Hawkeye's Quiver, which you can exhaust to search the top 5 cards of your deck for an arrow event. This is functionally card draw. The arrow event can't be spent on other cards, but it can be played, so it functions somewhat similar to card draw. Hawkeye also has 2 copies of Expert Marksman, which allow him to generate a wild resource for an arrow event. I would rank his card draw / resource generation as slightly above average. Not much, but slightly above average. The issue is that his burst damage is not good. He has Vibranium Arrow, which can deal 6 damage to an enemy with piercing. And he has Sonic Arrow and Electric Arrow, which can do 3 or 5 damage and provide a stun or a confuse. He also has an arrow which deals AoE damage, but only for 3. So his burst damage isn't great. The whole idea behind his kit is that it provides versatility. It provides a way to stun, it provides a way to confuse, it provides a way to ignore the crisis icon. But the issue with that is that the versatility comes at the expense of power. And versatility at the expense of power nearly always results in a fairly lackluster hero for solo play. Nonetheless, there are some things that Hawkeye can do. He doesn't have a hand size of 4, he's not overly reliant on his alter ego, and he doesn't have any kind of broken mechanics or anything. He's going in the C tier. There's going to be a lot of heroes in the C or D tier that just have kind of weak stats. Weak stats is a downside that has to be overcome by a very strong kit, and there's only a couple of heroes that do that. Most of the ones in the A, S, or S plus tier are going to be heroes with pretty strong stats, at least 5 or 6. The heroes with weak stats, they've got something to overcome, and Hawkeye's kit doesn't do enough to do that. His resource / card draw is slightly above average, but his damage is on the weak side. He does have versatility though. But versatility in true solo isn't good, as I mentioned, and the reason is because versatility is really intended to fill in the gaps in a team context. You have different players fulfilling different roles on the team, and then you may have one hero who can do a variety of different things so that he can fill in whatever gaps the other players leave in the team comp. But the issue is that's just not very good in true solo, where you need the hero to really be able to do everything. Next up is Spider-Woman. Spider-Woman is an interesting hero because of her unique deck building aspect. She has double agent. Choose 2 aspects instead of 1 during deck building. You must include an equal number of cards from those aspects in your deck. So that allows for some unique combos. Now that's the good, and the good makes her pretty fun to play. She does have weak stats, but when you play an aspect card, she gets +1/+1/+1 until the end of the round. That also allows for some unique interactions with certain cards because you can get her stats up to 3/3/3 or 4/4/4 on a good turn. Now the issue with Spider-Woman is that when we apply the criteria that we're looking for very high level play, she doesn't measure up very well. Resource generation or card draw. She really only has finesse, which is generate a wild resource for an aspect card. So it doesn't work on her hero cards, only aspect cards. And in terms of her burst damage, or damage that ignores retaliate, she's got Venom Blast, which can deal 5, but that's the best she can do, and that's not very good. It's not terrible in terms of cost efficiency, but it's really not very good. And so she doesn't have a way to deal with retaliate. She's got a stun and a confuse in one card, which is good, but it's not good against steady or stalwart villains. So her kit is really quite lacking in the event area, with pretty lackluster damage, and her resource generation isn't that great either. The thing that she brings to the table is that deck building, with the ability to include cards from 2 different aspects, which can open up some interesting combos, but none of the aspect cards really make up for weaker card draw or resource generation. They can help a little bit in some circumstances, but you really need the hero kit to do that well. So Spider-Woman's another hero that's going into the C tier. There are also going to be plenty of turns where you just can't come up with very many aspect cards, and then her stats don't end up being that good. I'd say 1 is pretty reasonable to expect. 2 is a little more rare but doable. So I really like playing the hero, but unfortunately she just doesn't deal with retaliate well, and when the villain is bringing a lot of resources to the table, like a lot of attachments that you need to spend resources on in order to get rid of, she's really got no way to do that. Because finesse being her resource generator, finesse only generates a resource for an aspect card, and it can't be used to generate resources in order to deal with the attachments that many bosses will bring to the table. So doesn't generate resources well, doesn't deal with retaliate well. Pheromones is next to, if not useless, against steady or stalwart villains, so that's why Spider-Woman is going in the C tier. She certainly wouldn't be placed there if we were ranking heroes based on fun, but that is not what we're doing here. Next up we have Ant-Man. Ant-Man is one of my personal favorite heroes in the game. He has the standard 5 hit size. He also has Ant-Man's helmet, and Ant-Man's helmet has the hero response after you change to tiny hero form, draw a card, which you can do every other round, or every round if you drew a resize every round, which allows you to change to your other hero form, and then you can then swap back to tiny, which will draw you 2 cards and give you the benefits of swapping forms. If you have Ant-Man's helmet out, you can draw 2 cards, and then you also have Pim Particles, which after you spend this card, if you're in tiny hero form, draw a card. That is reasonable card draw. It's above average, and in addition to his card draw, he has damage that is immune to retaliate. He has Army of Ants. If you are in tiny hero form, exhaust Army of Ants, deal 1 damage to an enemy. You can do that every round, and it's immune to retaliate, which gives us the ability to deal with retaliate bosses. And in addition to Army of Ants for damage, we have the card Giant Stomp, which deals 8 damage while you're in hero form. It's not exceptional, but it is a nice addition, which helps finish off villains that we've pinged down with Army of Ants. So when you add up all of these factors, the Ant-Man's helmet, the resize, the Pym particles, the damage that's immune to retaliate, what we're looking at is a solid S tier hero. He's not capable of taking on all of the content in the game, but he's capable of taking on a lot, including at least one of the big three villains on expert difficulty. That would be Magneto. Didn't have any luck with him against Venom Goblin or Ronin on expert difficulty, but Magneto was reasonably easy. And so there's a lot of content that Ant-Man can do. I really like this hero. He's a lot of fun. He's not S+. There are also things that he can't do. He's not good at monster turns because he doesn't often draw enough cards in order to have one. And he doesn't have the kind of burst damage that the heroes that are going in the S+ tier are capable of. But he is very, very strong. Next up we have Wasp. Well, unfortunately Wasp isn't that good. The differences between Wasp and Ant-Man, well, Wasp doesn't have Ant-Man's helmet. She has, in fact, no way to draw any cards or resources, except for she also has access to Pym particles. That's it for her in terms of extra card draw or resource generation, and that makes a big difference. Another note about Ant-Man, he's also capable of healing. He has one of the most efficient heals in the game. There aren't that many. And that helps him as well to deal with retaliate because it gives him the ability to heal that damage off without needing to flip to alter ego. Wasp doesn't have that. She doesn't have the healing. She doesn't have the card draw of Ant-Man's helmet. She also doesn't have resize. Her best damage is probably Pinpoint Strike, which deals 7 damage to an enemy. Or if you're in Tiny, it deals 8, and Overkill. 8 for 3 is pretty much standard. It's not that good for a hero-specific damage card. She also has Wasp Sting, which allows you to deal a total of 4 divided among enemies, or if you are in Tiny form, deal 5 damage to a single enemy. The 4 divided among enemies is another example of diversity at the expense of, or not diversity, but versatility. Not diversity, versatility at the expense of power, because the card is weaker than you would expect if it didn't have the dual options. And versatility at the expense of power in solo is not good. Now there's nothing in particular that is broken about Wasp's kit. She's functional. She does have the standard 5 hand size, no resource generation or card draw, but she's capable of doing some things. She's not going to go in the dumpster tier, she's going in the C tier, along with the other heroes there who just don't generate resources or cards very well. That's kind of the hallmark of all of the heroes there. Hawkeye and Spider-Woman have a resource generator that they can use for specific things. Black Widow can draw a card from time to time. Wasp has Pym particles, but we're looking for more than that. From the heroes that are above them so far in the A and S tiers, they all draw cards pretty well, except for Captain America, who's one of the best defensive heroes in the game. So hopefully we'll start to see a pattern forming in where these heroes are going as the tier list goes on. Next up we have Quicksilver. Quicksilver is a very fun hero to play after you use one of Quicksilver's basic powers, thwart, attack, or defense ready him. He does start out with very weak stats and only 9 hit points. For resource generation, he has friction resistance, which costs 3, and after you ready Quicksilver, ready this card. You have multiple ways to ready Quicksilver in his kit, and then you can exhaust friction resistance to generate a strength resource. Can we get to the kind of mega turn that I talked about at the beginning of the video, where you're generating 2 or 3 or 4 resources extra per turn? Yeah, you can do that with Quicksilver, but not consistently. And you may have to cycle through the deck once before you're able to set that up, because friction resistance is only 1 card in your 40 card deck. When we look at his damage, it's practically non-existent. You can deal 2 damage to an enemy 2 times. You'll take 2 retaliate damage for that. His way to damage enemies is by attacking a lot and readying. Basic attacking a lot, readying himself, then attacking again. That's terrible against retaliate. It's really, really bad against retaliate. And when you combine that with Quicksilver's weak stats and therefore weak early game, and the difficulty of setting up a very big turn with friction resistance, a lot of times you're just going to generate 1 extra resource from friction resistance, or 2. And he has no way to draw extra cards, so tough to cycle through the deck to find the most important cards that you want. Tough early game, very tough to deal with any kind of retaliate. And so Quicksilver is also going in the C tier. That's one thing that nearly all of these C tier heroes are going to have in common, or a lot of them anyway, is that their stats are weak. And weak stats is a burden. There's not much doubt in my mind about that. So Quicksilver, he's fun. Like Spider-Woman, he's a lot of fun. He is limited in what he can do on a high difficulty in true solo, though. And the last hero of cycle number 2 is Scarlet Witch. Speaking of, I would absolutely love if Quicksilver were errated to give you the option of choosing either the Avengers or the X-Men trait for him. Same with Scarlet Witch. I would also love if Spider-Man or Spider-Woman were errated, so that you could choose either the Avengers or the Web Warriors trait for them. That would probably improve my ranking of Spider-Woman, and maybe Spider-Man. It's not the case. Anyway, Scarlet Witch has next to no way to generate resources or draw cards. She can sometimes draw cards with Hexbolt. If you draw a card with 2 boost icons, or you discard a card with 2 boost icons from the top of the encounter deck when you use Hexbolt. The good thing is that the Hexbolt damage is immune to retaliate because it's not labeled as an attack. And in addition, one of the best things about Scarlet Witch is that she has the Mystic trait. And the Mystic trait gives her access to one of the best cards in the game, which is Sorcerer Supreme. Sorcerer Supreme allows her to increase her hand size from 5 to 6 and gives her badly needed additional resource generation. That, combined with the immunity to retaliate on the Hexbolt, the ability for it to draw cards, and it is fairly efficient and event Hexbolt for its cost, and she also has the cost reduction card Chaos Magic, which allows you to play a card from hand, ignoring its resource cost, and discard cards from the top of the encounter deck equal to that card's printed resource cost, which we don't really care about. So it's good to play like a 5 cost ally in a Scarlet Witch deck, because Chaos Magic can get it into play for free. So you combine those things, we got an above average hero. Scarlet Witch is going in the B tier. The 1 additional card from Sorcerer Supreme is good. It's definitely not exceptional. We would prefer more, and the cost efficiency of Hexbolt is pretty good. Chaos Magic is definitely very good, but there's only 1 of them in the deck. Hexbolt is good but unreliable sometimes, so that's why Scarlet Witch doesn't go higher than B tier, but she is definitely above average and a lot of fun to play. I enjoy playing that hero. Next up is Groot. Well, we're into the Galaxy's Most Wanted heroes. The Galaxy's Most Wanted cycle, which is the Guardians of the Galaxy cycle. And in Galaxy's Most Wanted, we have Groot and Rocket Raccoon, and unfortunately, Groot is not good. He has no resource generation or card draw whatsoever, which is rare, but not unheard of. And in addition, his events rely on him being able to build up growth counters to be effective. And his hero ability is a forced interrupt. When Groot would take any amount of damage, remove that many growth counters from him. For each growth counter removed this way, prevent one of that damage. So anytime that Groot takes damage, inadvertently or otherwise, and there are many, many, many scenarios in which you can't help but take some damage. In fact, pretty rare that you go a game without taking any damage. It'll take away your growth counters, and that can make it very, very hard to build up the growth counters in true solo. And if you can't build up the growth counters, then your events will never be very efficient. But even if they were efficient, and the maximum efficiency would probably be, well, there isn't really a maximum, but if you could get the counters up to 10 or so, that would be quite good, or 9. That would be quite good with I Am Groot, which deals damage to an enemy equal to the number of growth counters. But even if you could do that, Groot wouldn't be overpowered because he doesn't have any card draw or resource generation. So I really think Groot could have been made with no forced on that interrupt. His hero power could simply say interrupt. And you could then choose if you want to lose growth counters or not. And I don't think Groot would be overpowered. I don't think we'd be looking at an S+ tier hero with that. I'm not even sure we'd be looking at an S tier hero. And so I wish that had been the case. Or that there'd be an errata to remove the forced part of the interrupt. But this is not the case, and as such I consider Groot to be a hero whose mechanics are almost completely busted for true solo play, and therefore he is going in the F tier. He is not good. Not good at all, and I certainly don't recommend him if your objective is to take on very difficult content, though he does have his use as a fun or thematic hero, which isn't for everyone. But there are definitely players who enjoy playing Groot simply for the theming. And of particular note is that the Galaxy's Most Wanted cycle contains some very difficult scenarios and is still widely thought of as the most difficult cycle, coupled with, unfortunately, one of the worst heroes in the game. Moving on, we've got Rocket Raccoon, the second hero in the Galaxy's Most Wanted expansion. Rocket has relatively weak stats, 2-1-1, and we've talked before about how relatively weak stats, well, the hero's got to really do something special in order to overcome that, and there aren't that many heroes that can do it. So far, Iron Man is the only one we've really looked at that I believe that can overcome 2-1-1 in stats, and Iron Man can build his hand size up to 7 every round relatively quickly. Let's take a look at Rocket. Rocket has relatively low amount of hit points to go with his weak stats, and after you deal excess damage to an enemy, damage beyond what you need to kill them, you draw 1 card. Now that can be quite good in certain scenarios. There are a number of scenarios, though, where not a lot of minions come out. You certainly can't rely on a minion being on the table every single round. And in that circumstance, a lot of the rounds you're simply going to be playing with a hand size of 5. And Rocket doesn't have any other way to draw cards or generate resources. In addition, when his tech upgrades, he relies on these tech upgrades to deal his damage. And when his tech upgrades are spent, they need to be discarded because the tech upgrades are restricted, so they need to be discarded in order to make way for more tech upgrades. And the way to do that is using Rocket's alter ego action. Now you can draw cards using that. I mentioned that you he doesn't have any other way to generate resources or draw cards that was not accurate. He does have his alter ego ability, Tinkering, where you can choose a tech upgrade you control to draw 2 cards. That's not bad. You could also use Repurpose, a Repurpose rocket build. But it's not reliable. You're not always going to have a tech upgrade that you want to discard when you need to discard it. It's hard to have a big turn with Rocket. And in addition, the damage on his cards is reasonably efficient in terms of its cost if you get fully set up, but it doesn't deal a lot of damage per attack, and the problem with that is that we then are very prone to retaliate damage, and Rocket doesn't have a lot of HP in order to deal with retaliate damage well. So when you combine all of these factors, the need to flip to Alter Ego to take full advantage of his kit, the relatively low damage per attack on his attacks, and the spotty nature of his card draw or resource generation depending on which scenario you're facing. We're looking at a hero that at least doesn't do well against retaliate, doesn't do well against low minion scenarios, and has to flip to Alter Ego in order to take full advantage of his kit. He's fun, but he's going in the, I would say, C-, D+ tier. Probably the C tier. I would say D tier because of his over-reliance on his Alter Ego. We penalized Black Panther for that as well, since he has to flip to Alter Ego to use Golden City. Miss Marvel, I'd say Rocket's in the same category. He might be a little bit better than those heroes, but he's definitely on the weaker side. Now, he is fun to play, and he's thematic, and that is worth noting. But, again, this tier list is for determining which heroes are going to be able to defeat a lot of the content on expert difficulty in true solo, and Rocket isn't one of those heroes because of his weaknesses against retaliate and his weakness against, well, the fact that you can't take full advantage of his kit against enemies that don't have a lot of minions, and you have to flip to Alter Ego to use his draw 2 cards and cycle the tech upgrades out, and that isn't good. Isn't good in true solo. We don't want to be flipping to Alter Ego really at all in true solo if we could help it. If we could stay in Alter Ego the entire game, that would just be perfect. You can get away with once, typically, flipping to Alter Ego once. If you flip twice, that's rough. I don't know what my win rate is when I flip twice to Alter Ego when I have to do that with any other hero except Spider-Ham, who can get away with it. But with any other hero except Spider-Man, if I have to flip to Alter Ego twice, I'd guess my win rate is pretty low in expert difficulty. I'd expect 40% would be the ceiling. Probably lower than that. Probably lower. Could be a lot lower. So if we have to flip to Alter Ego multiple times in order to take advantage of a hero's kit, that's not going to be a good hero for true solo. Different story in multiplayer. Different story in multiplayer. He's likely far more playable in multiplayer. But this list is primarily for true solo. And so Rocket's got his weaknesses for sure. Next up we got Star-Lord. Well, I would say that the Guardians of the Galaxy cycle is overall a fairly weak cycle. And part of the problem there is that the Galaxy's most wanted scenarios are so difficult, and that makes the Guardians heroes look worse by comparison. However, Star-Lord is really, really good. Star-Lord is an exceptional hero. Probably my favorite hero to play in the game. So what does Star-Lord do well? Well, I mentioned the criteria that we're looking for in a hero, and I've gone over that ad nauseum with each different hero. Star-Lord does really well at generating resources. When you play a card from your hand, deal yourself 1 face down encounter card, reduce the resource cost to play that card by 3, and then Star-Lord also has Star-Lord's helmet. a 1-cost upgrade. While you're in hero form, you get +1 hand size for each face down encounter card in front of you to a maximum of +3 hand size. I will use Star-Lord's hero power very, very sparingly until I get Star-Lord's helmet. When I get Star-Lord's helmet, then I'll use Star-Lord's hero power freely nearly every round, because the upside of drawing an extra card offsets the downside of getting an extra encounter card. So in addition to Star-Lord generating resources well, he can also take good advantage of Nowhere. Nowhere, a basic card, play only if your identity has the Guardian trait. Increase your ally limit by 1 after a player plays a Guardian ally. Exhaust Nowhere, that player draws a card. Well, when you're playing Star-Lord, he says each ally you control gains the Guardian trait. So you can use Nowhere to essentially draw an extra card every round, or most rounds, because you're typically going to play an ally every round or almost every round. So I mentioned that what we're after in terms of our resource generation or card draw is the ability to have these mega turns where we can... Well, the reason you want to have the ability to have a mega turn is because a mega turn in True Solo allows you to both set up a card that will allow you to ramp up into the future and deal with whatever came out on the board this round. So let's say in a typical turn, the villain, you're playing on a Heroic 1 scenario, and the villain brings out, let's say, an encounter card that gives him an extra attack, and then he brings out a minion, or he brings out 2 minions. Well, if you want to advance against the villain in that round, you've got to deal with the 2 minions. But you also have to increase the amount of power available to you on the table for future turns, because what you're trying to do in Stage 2 is get set up to take on Stage 3. Stage 3 is always going to be harder than Stage 2 because the villain gains additional attacks and often additional abilities as well. And if you're starting out the game at a certain power level, and the villain's going to be gaining power as the game goes along, because the villain's going to bring out attachments, not all of which you can actually deal with all of the time, because we don't generate infinite resources. And then the villain's also going to be increasing his stats and some of his abilities when he enters Stage 3. So as the game goes along, we need to increase the power level available to us. And when you generate 3 or 4 or 5 extra resources or cards in a round, that gives you the ability to deal with the 2 minions that entered the board, or the 2 encounter cards that entered the board during the villain's turn, and also play a card like Nowhere, like Avengers Mansion, like Star-Lord's helmet, or an element gun, or whatever else you want to do that will stick to the board and give you an increased amount of power or resources for future turns. It is very, very difficult to play a card like Avengers Mansion when you're playing on Heroic 1 difficulty, because when the villain is bringing 2 encounter cards to the table every round, if you spend an entire turn and all you do is play Avengers Mansion, then you haven't dealt with the board at all. And that means the next turn that you will essentially have to deal with 4 encounter cards. And on high difficulty, if there ever comes a turn where you really can't deal with what the villain's done that turn, you're probably going to die. Probably going to die. So if you want to be able to play a card like Avengers Mansion that ramps you up for future turns, you have to have a mega turn in which you can both play Avengers Mansion and deal with the board in that turn. Not so easy. Of course, you can also do it if the villain should have a dud turn where the encounter cards aren't that harmful to you, but especially on hard scenarios, that doesn't really happen. It can happen on easier scenarios, but it doesn't really happen on difficult scenarios. So a hero like Doctor Strange, who has these mega Winds of Watum turns, or Star-Lord, who can have mega turns where you have extra card draw of 3 thanks to Star-Lord's helmet, and then an additional reduce the resource cost to play a card by 3. You have the ability to get out a card like Avengers Mansion, or like Nowhere, or like Helicarrier, or Quinjet, or Quincarrier, not Quinjet, or something like that that ramps you up for the future, and also deal with the board that round. That's why we're looking for resource generation / card draw, and Star-Lord provides that. The second criteria that we're looking for is the event power. And Star-Lord has Sliding Shot, a 3-cost event that deals 5 damage to an enemy plus 2 additional for each face-down encounter card in front of you. And one of the great things about that is that one of the things that villains on high difficulty often bring to the table is that they add additional encounter cards when they swap phases. So at the start of the game, Venom Goblin deals 2 encounter cards per player. When he switches to stage 3, he deals 3 encounter cards per player, and that provides an opportunity for Star-Lord to OTK the villain in stage 3 or close to it if you set up well. Because if you, for example, there's no cap on the amount of encounter cards you can have in front of you. So you've got the 3 from Venom Goblin already because you switched to stage 3. You pushed him into stage 3 this round. With just the 3, you'd have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 damage from Sliding Shot. And then you could also play like a Daring Escape or use Star-Lord's hero power, add 2, add 2. You can easily get up to 13 against Venom Goblin. And if you've set up your hand well and you've delayed in stage 2 until you're ready to go, you can get off 2 sliding shots in one round and simply OTK a villain like Venom Goblin without ever needing to face his stage 3 at all. Star-Lord is an S+ tier hero. It wasn't necessarily what I expected after my first impressions of him, but once I did dedicated playtesting, once all the cards were released, he's an S+ tier hero. In my opinion, capable of taking on any scenario in the game, and I have playthroughs on the channel of him going up against all 3 of the most difficult villains in the game on expert difficulty, and I can vouch for his ability to take on a wide variety of Heroic 1 scenarios as well, using a leadership Star-Lord deck. So he's my favorite hero to play. Now, in multiplayer, it's important that if you're going to bring him to a multiplayer game that your teammates be aware of his mechanics and on board with it, because if you're dealing a lot of encounter cards, you may create problems that your teammates will have to help you deal with, and they may or may not be cool with that. But Star-Lord is a beast in true solo. He's really, really good. S+ tier. It's not quite as good as Doctor Strange, but he's not that far behind. I really like this hero. Next up we have Gamora. Well, Gamora's got strong stats. Gamora falls squarely into the category of heroes that do damage over time, that don't have access to a lot of burst damage. Gamora's alter ego gives us access to this deck building gimmick. Skilled Tactician, you may include up to 6 attack and or thwart events in your deck from aspects other than your chosen aspect, which is fun. For Resource Generator, she's got access to 2 Keen Instincts, which you can exhaust to generate a wild resource for an attack or thwart event. Now, the problem with these resource generators that exhaust or that generate resources for a specific purpose is that they can't then be used to get rid of enemy attachments. And in addition, there's always going to be cards in your deck that you want to play that aren't you can't use your resource generator to generate a resource for. That was a kind of a convoluted way to say that Keen Instincts isn't always useful as a resource generator, and so I would definitely consider Gamora's resource generation to be on the weaker side. And in terms of her burst damage potential, it's not much. Decisive Blow is the best that she's got. She can deal 4 damage or 7 if you play to thwart this turn. Now, what we're essentially looking at here is a pretty average hero. There's nothing broken about her kit. It broken in terms of it doesn't work. And there's nothing particularly powerful about it either. She doesn't generate the big turns that we need to ramp up for the high difficulty stuff. She has a decent defensive card. She can deal decent damage over time, but she isn't very good against high difficulty content. She's going into the C tier. I consider her roughly equivalent to Black Widow, more or less. There's nothing particularly exceptional about her. There's nothing particularly broken about her. So I wouldn't expect her to take on too much high difficulty stuff, but she's fun. She's thematic. So for fans of Gamora or players who want to play like a Guardians team, I could recommend Gamora because she would pair well with Star-Lord and then probably like Venom and Nebula as the best Guardians team off the top of my head. And so that would be the context in which I would recommend her. But for true solo players looking for heroes that will be able to take on a wide variety of high difficulty scenarios, Gamora falls in the C tier for me. Next up we have Drax. Well, Drax has hand size of 4, and that's not good. Drax has weak stats to start off, and that's not good. He builds up his attack for his vengeance counters, and those come after the villain attacks Drax. And once the vengeance counters are built up, he can draw a card. He can also draw cards with his Dwythete Mastery. After Drax makes a basic attack, draw 1 card. It only costs 1. That's a good card. The issue with Drax is A, the hand size of 4. It's really, really, really tough for heroes to overcome the hand size of 4. There's really only one, in my opinion, who has a hand size of 4 or less that gets above the C tier, and most of them don't make it out of the D tier. Then you also have a lack of burst damage. You do have Knife Leap, and it can be quite cost efficient because you reduce the cost for each vengeance counter, and when you make a basic attack, you get +5 attack. Now the issue is with Dwythete Mastery and also with Knife Leap, you have to have a basic attack available. That means you can't be using your basic action to defend against attacks, and it also means on turns when the villain gets the encounter card Exhaustion, which exhausts you and is a standard card in any expert level scenario and comes up quite a lot, well then you're crippled for that turn if you don't have a way to ready Drax. Crippled as in you can't use the cards that require you to have your basic action available. Drax isn't good in solo play. He's going in the D tier. There are some things that he can do. I think he's probably worse than Thor. He's not totally broken, though, like I would consider She-Hulk, Hulk, or Groot. But he's definitely on the weaker side. He doesn't do enough to overcome his hand size of 4. And he's yet another hero that, in my opinion, would have been just fine if he had a hand size of 5. It would definitely move him up a tier or 2. I don't think it would break him, though. Same with Thor. Same with Hulk. Same with She-Hulk, I think. Hand size of 4 doesn't need to exist in the game, which I've said before, but, you know, there are not a lot of heroes in the game that can take on all of the content in the game on expert difficulty. And there will probably be players who say, that's as it should be. There are players who believe that Doctor Strange is too powerful and should be nerfed. My opinion is that if each hero that's at Doctor Strange's tier gets nerfed, then we will actually have no way to beat, at least in true solo, Ronan and possibly Venom Goblin on expert difficulty. And if we're going to have no way to beat Venom Goblin or Ronan on expert difficulty, then why bother printing a stage 3 at all for those heroes? The issue is, if you're going to print really difficult scenarios like Venom Goblin on expert or Ronan, you've also got to make heroes that can defeat them. Otherwise, why do they exist? And if you make heroes that can defeat them, then those heroes are going to seem OP because those scenarios are really hard. Way harder than anything else in the game. So you make a hero like Doctor Strange that can defeat Ronan or Venom Goblin on with a reasonable win rate. I wouldn't say he dominates. I'd say his win rate's, I don't know, 40%. Nothing exceptional. And then a lot of players say, well, Doctor Strange is too powerful. But if we didn't have him, or if we didn't have heroes that are at his tier, then we just have no way to beat some of the content that the developers printed. And I don't think we want that. So there's got to be heroes that exist that are really powerful, because there are scenarios that exist that are really difficult. Now, maybe the Heroic 1 level wasn't always made to be beaten. And that's fine, because Heroic 1 was kind of tacked on afterwards. There's no additional cards printed for Heroic 1. You just add additional encounter cards to play on that difficulty, and so I'm fine with that not being beatable. Though I think Vision can defeat any Heroic 1 scenario in the game. But it's fine that Heroic 1 or Heroic 2 wasn't really made to be beaten, because there were no additional cards printed for it. It's not like you're missing out on content that you received in your hero pack or in your expansion box. But if we couldn't beat Ronin on Expert, then why did we pay to have a Ronin Stage 3 printed, and why did we buy it? It's got to be beatable. For it to be beatable, we need heroes like Doctor Strange. It's just the situation. And right now we just don't have a lot of them. We're going to end up with about 5, maybe 6 S+ tier heroes out of the 43, I think, that are in the game. That's a pretty low number. I'd prefer that there be more heroes that could take on all of the content in the game. And maybe Ronin or Venom Goblin needs a nerf in order for that to happen. That's very possible. Maybe those two get nerfed. Maybe hand size of 4 doesn't exist in the game. Maybe Groot's a little less broken. And then we'd probably be looking at a game where more heroes could take on all of the content, or at least most of it. And then I think players would be interested in buying more heroes. But that's not the situation. So we're giving recommendations based on the situation as it is. And as it is, there's not going to be a lot of S+ tier heroes or even S tier heroes. Anyway, that long rant was all about how much I dislike the hand size of 4 because of how it limits player options, what players are able to do each round. And I think you want players to have a lot of options in a card game, because it makes the card game varied and more complex and more replayable. Anyway, Drax is a D tier hero. I'll climb down off of my soapbox now, and we'll move on to the next hero, which is Venom. I like Venom. Venom has a couple of different ways to generate resources. Venom can take 1 damage to generate a wild resource once per phase, which is very good. I like that ability a lot. It does require that he flips to Alter Ego more often than the average hero, though, if you take advantage of that ability excessively. Then he also has Spider Sense, which gives him the Spider-Man hero ability, so that when the villain initiates an attack against you, draw a card. Those two things combined give Venom above average resource generation. And that's good. He does well defensively as well. In some ways, I would consider him a defensive specialist, because he's got his pistols that can add to his defensive stat when you defend an attack, which can boost him up to 4 defense, which is very strong. The issue with Venom, well, there's really 2 issues. Number 1, the multi-gun. The multi-gun is very, very good, but his kit does rely on it, and you can't get it reliably. His Alter Ego says that at the start of the game, you discard cards until you get a weapon upgrade, which you can then add to your hand. Well, the issue is that you get a multi-gun and 2 pistols in your deck by default, and therefore, if those are the only weapons you're running, you only have a 1 in 3 chance of getting the multi-gun. And that means that in the games where you get lucky and the 1 in 3 comes up and you get the multi-gun, you're going to have a much better game than the games in which you don't get lucky and you get one of the pistols. And that's a little bit frustrating to play. I would prefer actually that his setup ability simply say search your deck for the multi-gun and add it to your hand. You'd still have to pay the 3 resources to get it out, but given that his kit relies on it quite a lot, I'm not sure I see a reason why players need to be frustrated 2/3 of the time and not get it to start the game. I don't think it breaks Venom to just give him the multi-gun to start the game. It happens 1 in 3 games anyway. So I don't get it. I don't see a reason for the discard at the start of the game mechanic as opposed to simply searching the deck to find the multi-gun or searching the deck to find a weapon upgrade of your choice. Just in case players prefer to not do that or prefer to run an additional weapon upgrade that they could go find. I'd like that a lot better, and I don't think it would break Venom. But that's not what we got. So that's the first issue with Venom. The second issue is that he simply doesn't do burst damage. That's one of the reasons I would consider him a defensive specialist. Somewhat similar to Captain America in that regard. He likes to do a lot of consistent damage over time. Now the multi-gun can attack without, or can deal damage without being an attack, so it's not prone to retaliate, and that is quite good. But apart from that, he doesn't have damage that's immune to retaliate, and he doesn't have large burst damage, so that's a weakness of his kit. But the spider sense and the resource generation built into his hero power are good. The multi-gun is good. He is going in the S-A+ tier. I do think he is worse than Spider-Man, but not by a lot, and they're pretty similar in what they're trying to do. They're both defensive specialists. They play differently, but I would consider them roughly equal in power level. So Venom can do a lot, and there are certain scenarios against which he really excels, but there are also scenarios like Villains with Retaliate in which he does not do that well. One of the reasons I focus on Retaliate so much is that Venom, Goblin, and Ronin, 2 of the hardest heroes in the game, both have Retaliate. And so I would like that players who view this tier list and decide to buy one of the heroes in the S+ tier and fully build out their decks to make them as good as possible, I would like those players to be able to do so with confidence, knowing that they will then be able to defeat the hardest content in the game that maybe they haven't been able to defeat before. I do not want players buying content that I've ranked highly and then being disappointed afterwards, because that sucks. We've all experienced it if we play card games. It's never fun. I'd like to avoid it. That's why I watch videos like this, or for entertainment. And so we'd like to avoid that if possible. And so again, that's why maybe a little bit harder on some heroes than I need to be, just so that players can buy with confidence if choosing to make buying decisions based on this tier list. In terms of what Venom's best aspect it is, you could make a case for protection. I like leadership as well with clarity of purpose. I think it synergizes pretty well. I'm not sure one's really better than the other. Aggression can do some things too. So Venom's really good, and I like him a lot. He's a very fun hero to play. Not the best hero of the Guardians, but he doesn't beat Star-Lord in that regard, but he's very good. So the best Guardians team, in my opinion, for a 4-player team would be Star-Lord, Venom, Gamora, and a hero we haven't looked at who is, and that is Nebula. Moving on, we are into the Galaxy's Most Wanted expansion heroes now, and the 3rd cycle in the game, and the first up is Spectrum. Spectrum has very weak stats, 1/1/1, but she does have 3 energy forms, and any one of the energy forms will buff one of her stats by 2. Now, multiple issues with Spectrum. First, again, resources are a problem. Speed of Light can draw a card when you change energy forms. You get 3 of those. And then you have energy duplication, which can generate the printed resource on your face-up energy form upgrade, which is going to be one of 3 different resource types, and that's good. You can use it for whatever you want. So as far as resource generators go, that's pretty good. Now the issue with Spectrum is really her weak stats. And being able to buff any one stat is nice, but you can't change energy forms whenever you want to. It's not like Ant-Man or Wasp where you can change form whenever you want. You need a specific card that allows you to change form, and that means you can get stuck in the wrong form and really end up with only one stat when you actually, one stat in a category where you actually need 2 or 3. So her weak stats do hurt her even though we have the ability to buff them. The energy duplications are nice. The drawing a card when you change forms is nice. But the getting stuck in the form that you don't want to be in is really frustrating and clunky. And so Spectrum is a D tier hero, in my opinion, with a mechanic that is partly non-functional. That's how it felt to me playing Spectrum and trying to get to the energy form that I want for each situation. And in addition to the energy form problem, her best attack is 7 damage, and that isn't very good. You can give it overkill if you're already in Gamma energy form, but it's still not very good. So the resources are nice, maybe a little bit above average, but they don't make up for the weak stats, the clunky energy form changes, and the weak damage on the events. And I think that probably the reason that the stats on the events are a little lower than you might expect or hope for is because of the versatility of the hero. So she's got the ability to have 3 thwart, 3 attack, or 3 defense, depending on which form you're in. She can change form to meet different challenges. And when that's working well, that gives her some versatility. And the general pattern is when a hero has versatility is that their overall power suffers to compensate. And as such, for true solo play, versatility that comes at the expense of power isn't very good, in my opinion. And so, even though we like the energy duplication, overall, I think this is a D tier hero who's not capable of taking on that many scenarios on high difficulty. Next up we have Adam Warlock. Adam Warlock is a very interesting hero. He has a deck building gimmick, which is during deck building your deck must include an equal number of cards from all 4 aspects. You cannot include more than 1 copy of any non-Adam Warlock card. That is a very interesting deck building challenge that I enjoyed. The issues with Adam Warlock: his stats are weak, and his damage isn't very good. He's got Karmic Blast, which is relatively cost efficient, but it doesn't get up to the numbers that we're looking for in order to down bosses without taking too much retaliate damage. Now the upside, he's got Mystic Senses, so he can draw a card after you resolve Battle Mage. The problem is you have to discard a card in order to resolve Battle Mage. So if you get 1 copy of Mystic Senses out, you're really just breaking even. You really need 2 to get out to gain card advantage. He does also have access to Sorcerer Supreme. He has access to his cape, which he can use to ready himself. He has access to a wild resource from a resource generator, which is good. He has access to Soul World. When he's at full build, he's above average in his resource generation, that's for sure. He's still not that great at burst damage, but he's above average in his resource generation for sure. The issue is his early game is very weak because you need to get 2 copies of Mystic Senses on the board before you're really generating anything extra beyond what you start with. You also need to get out his cape, his staff, and those are 1-ofs in his deck. You also need Sorcerer Supreme, which is another 1-of. And it takes a while to get all of that set up, and against very difficult scenarios, you usually don't have a while. He's more of a multiplayer oriented hero because your teammates can cover those early game weaknesses for you. In true solo, he's just too slow a lot of the time, I find. But he is going in the C tier, because there are some things he's able to do, and if you can get through that kind of weaker early game and get 2 copies of Mystic Senses out and maybe the Karmic Staff, you'll get rolling and you'll be able to do some things along with the Sorcerer Supreme. You'll get rolling. It's just by the time you get to that point, a lot of times the boss has already either defeated you or he's built up to the point where you can't really come back, because Adam Warlock's late game isn't so overwhelmingly powerful that you can overcome a huge deficit, but it is good. He's definitely well above average in his late game, and a lot of fun to play when you get to the late game. The issue is just the length of time that it takes to get there, and so that's why he's going in the C tier for true solo and very difficult content. If he had a little bit better stats, like maybe Toothwort, I think that would make a big deal, and he'd likely make it at least to the B tier with Scarlet Witch. I'd like to see him at Toothwort, or even 222, and he might make it up to the A tier with Captain America. But a big part of the problem is that you just don't have the ability to do much thwarting unless you're willing to discard a card from hand, and then that would essentially be hand size 4 early before you can compensate for that with Mystic Senses. So I think he was probably understated because they weren't entirely sure how good the deck building aspect was going to be. He does have access to the Mystic cards, the events from each aspect that can only be played if you're Mystic, and he can play them all because he has access to all the aspects, and that is good. So his endgame is pretty powerful and it's pretty fun. It's just it takes a while to get there, and in high difficulty true solo, that's not good. Next up we have Nebula. Nebula's not bad. She's somewhat comparable to Black Widow or Gamora in the overall power of her abilities. But Nebula has an advantage over those two heroes. That is her alter ego ability. Cybernetic upgrades. After you play a technique upgrade, draw 2 cards. There are enough technique upgrades in the deck that you should be able to play one every time you enter alter ego. And those 2 cards that you get to draw with Nebula make a big difference. Her kit encourages you to switch to alter ego, and as I've talked about before, we don't really like that, but at least we can get some benefit from it. Her kit revolves around playing these technique upgrades, but they get resolved as soon as you start the turn with them on the table when you're in hero mode. So if you flip to alter ego and take advantage of the 2 card draw, and then you flip back and use lethal intent to resolve your special upgrades, then you can get some reasonably big turns out of it. Now, she struggles to deal the kind of burst damage that we need to do to deal with retaliate villains. So her ceiling is limited, but for the reasons that I've outlined, she does get higher than either Black Widow or Gamora. For me, she's a B tier hero. She's definitely not bad, above average, but the fact that her card draw is limited to her alter ego phase isn't great because we don't want to be an alter ego. She does have a resource generator, which is Nebula's ship, which is pretty good. Exhaust Nebula's ship to generate a wild resource, but it's only 1 card in her deck. So overall, she feels to me like a better version of Gamora. Or you could say the same about Black Widow, better version of Black Widow. Maybe a little bit similar to Rocket, because Rocket has his alter ego ability, which draws 2 cards, but Rocket has very fragile stats, and his card draw ability is not as easy to use as Nebula's. So Nebula, above average, and in my opinion, the third best of the Guardians heroes. So our full Guardians team, once again, Star-Lord, Venom, Nebula, and Gamora is the best possible. Guardians team, though, you could easily make a case for swapping Gamora with Adam Warlock, except that he's not a... No, he is a Guardian. I take that back. He is a Guardian. So, actually, I'd probably use Star-Lord, Venom, Nebula, and Adam Warlock now that I think about it. When I said Gamora was the fourth hero earlier, I forgot that Adam Warlock is also a Guardian. And I'd probably run him in a Guardians team. He'd be more fun, I think. And more powerful in the late game, though not as powerful in the early game. So, depending on the scenario, you could make a reasonable case for Gamora as well. Moving on, we've got War Machine. War Machine is not very good. War Machine, when you change to his hero form, you place 5 ammo counters, which is what he uses for his abilities. He does have upgraded chassis after you change to hero form exhausted to give him a tough status card. He has Gauntlet Gun. You can exhaust Gauntlet Gun to generate a wild resource, but only for a War Machine event. So his resource generation is limited. He doesn't have any way to draw cards, and he has to flip to his alter ego to recharge his ammo, as well as to use his upgraded chassis. These are big downsides. These are big downsides for War Machine in solo play. He's not good. The over-reliance on his alter ego ability is going to put him in the D tier, and he's pretty solidly in the D tier, in my opinion. He's rough. He's rough to play in true solo, and I would not recommend him except for fun or thematic reasons. I don't find him particularly fun myself, but other players may, or maybe big War Machine fans, and I would run him in a team only, and even then I wouldn't expect that much from him really, because of the, well, anemic resource generation, and then his events just don't deal that much damage either. It's a lot of slow damage over time, and that's rough to play against Retaliate villains, and some of the hardest ones in the game are Retaliate villains. So, not a hero I'm a big fan of. I don't think he's very good at all. This whole cycle is pretty rough. Yeah. Not much redeeming value in it. Next up we have Valkyrie. Well, Valkyrie revolves around this Deathglow upgrade that you attach to minions or villains, and then you get benefits when the attached enemy is defeated, which is why you really want to attach it to minions, because villains don't get defeated very often. So if Valkyrie defeated the enemy that Deathglow is attached to, you ready her, and then you set the card out of play and it can be reattached. It's barely worth it to pay 1 resource just to ready her, so you need these other abilities as well. You can draw a card using Valhalla. At a bare minimum, that's going to be needed. You can get plus defense, you can get plus attack, you can get 5 threat off of a scheme, but it all revolves around this Deathglow ability, and it just ends up that you struggle to do much of anything with Valkyrie, in my opinion. You can't really get much damage out of her. You can't get... you got 7, that's her max. You can give it overkill with Deathglow, but it's not that good. And you can't really generate the resources or cards necessary to have big turns. Valkyrie is, in my opinion, a hero whose central mechanic is just kind of busted and not that much fun to play. So she ends up feeling very weak when you do play her, and it doesn't help that she really has those low stats. I don't think that was necessary. It could have gone with like 2-2-2 or 2-2-3 or 2-3-2 even, and been just fine with Valkyrie. I don't think she would have been overpowered with those by any stretch. But as she is, her central mechanic, Deathglow, just doesn't function that well. It feels clunky, and it feels very expensive for what you get. And since it relies on you really defeating minions, you don't really want to play Deathglow on villains, because then you won't be able to take advantage of Valhalla, and you won't be able to take advantage of the Deathglow text to ready Valkyrie. You want to put it on minions, but if you end up in a scenario that doesn't have a lot of minions, which is a lot of them, then you end up with Deathglow not really having anything to do. And even when you do have something to do with it, it's relatively expensive for what it provides. So this hero is, in my opinion, quite broken, and wouldn't really recommend her for anyone, really, except for purely fun reasons. The last hero of this cycle is Vision. Vision is incredible, and that may come as a surprise to anyone who hasn't watched the gameplay videos that I posted of Vision, or who isn't familiar with the Bring It deck. But Vision has this intangible form where you reduce the amount of damage Vision takes from each attack by 2, which means that he's immune to attacks, or he doesn't take any damage from attacks from most minions. And then you can combine this ability, Intangible, with Vision's nemesis, which is Ultron. Ultron generates drones, and since Vision doesn't take damage from them, if you stay in intangible form when Ultron is on the table, Ultron will continue to generate drones over and over and over that cannot actually damage Vision as long as he's in intangible form. So you can build up a board of 7 or 8 or 9 drones against you, and then you can play Bring It from the aggression aspect, which draws a card for each minion on the table. And you can draw 7 or 8 or 9, or I think even in one game I drew 11 cards. And then you can set up an OTK of the boss with his damage cards, which aren't incredible. He's got Solar Beam for 7 damage. He's got Dense Strike for 5. Super Dense Strike for 5. These are not incredible events, but when you're drawing 10 or 11 cards in a turn, it turns out that it doesn't really matter if your events aren't that powerful, because you can use so many of them. At once, you can play 3 or 4 events in a turn to get the damage you need. And to make up for the retaliate damage that you will take, you have a special card which heals androids, which is called Reboot. Ready a friendly android character and heal 1 damage from it. And in addition, you have a healing card in the basic aspect that heals 2. And we wouldn't normally play these cards, but they're not very expensive. But when you draw 11 cards in a turn, you can afford to play cards that aren't very efficient. That's what we do with Vision. We use his incredible drawing abilities when Ultron is on the table and you're running Bring It to make up for the inefficiencies that exist other places in his kit. He also doesn't really generate resources except for Solar Gem. If it wasn't for the Bring It strategy, Vision really wouldn't be very good. He'd be a C tier hero, but because of Bring It and Intangible and the way those interact with his nemesis Ultron, Vision is going in the S+ tier. He is capable of taking on any scenario in the game. In fact, he's probably the only hero in the game that's capable of taking on most, if not all, scenarios on Heroic 1 difficulty, including Ronin. I haven't personally accomplished that. I've seen someone claim it on Marvel CDB, and I don't doubt it. I think it is possible. You may have to try a bunch of times in order to get Ultron out on turn 1 or turn 2 or something like that, but you could do it. Wouldn't be a high win rate, but you could do it. So his win rate against the high difficulty content isn't that great, because you do have to rely on Ultron coming out fairly early. He's really the only hero who wants to see his nemesis as soon as possible. And it's gimmicky. It's very gimmicky. His win rate's going to be about 20%. It's my experience that about 20% of the time you get Ultron out early. But after that, you can just roll over the villains. And for examples of this, I've got videos of it on my channel. Vision's really, really strong. He's going to be lower ranked than Star-Lord or Doctor Strange. He's going to be the lowest ranked of the S plus tier heroes because he's so gimmicky and because his win rate is kind of low because he really doesn't do well against scenarios where you can't stall until Ultron comes out. But he is probably the only hero that's capable of taking on all the content in the game on Heroic 1 difficulty. He's really, really, really good. If you play the Bring It deck. If you don't intend to build the Bring It deck, drop him down to the C tier. He's not very good without it. But if you do plan to build the Bring It deck, he's an S plus tier hero. So we're into the Sinister Motives cycle now. Cycle number 5. So we've done 4 cycles and we've got only 3 S plus tier heroes. Cycle number, I think it was 2, didn't have one. Doctor Strange came from cycle 1 and Star-Lord from Galaxy's Most Wanted, Vision from Mad Titan Shadow, though I think Vision was probably inadvertent. I don't think the developers intended for there to be a super powerful strategy involving deliberately wanting Ultron to stay on the table. Just my guess. That was not intended. And just ended up being an interaction between Intangible Form and Bring It that they didn't intend, but they haven't errated it as of August 12th, 2023, so right now you can do it. Anyway, into the Sinister Motives expansion with Ghost Spider. Ghost Spider is one of my favorite heroes in the game. She is a defensive specialist. After you resolve an interrupt or responsibility on an event-ready Ghost Spider, she's got a lot of those. She has her Ticket to the Multiverse, which allows for a kind of interesting mega turn. And she's also got Web Bracelets, which draw a card when you use an interrupt or response for resource generation. So her card draw is above average. Her resource generation is above average. Combined with her defensive specialist abilities, she's pretty good. She's not getting into the S tier, but she's pretty good. She's going up in the A tier along with Captain America. I do like her better than Captain America. These defense specialists tend to cap out around A tier because they don't really do well at burst damage. And that's kind of by design, right? They wouldn't be defensive specialists if they did burst damage. If they could defend really well and then do burst damage as well, they'd just be OP. But we really do need burst damage for True Solo, unless we've got damage that's immune to Retaliate. And Ghost Spider, when you use her with protection, I've seen protection decks with her that claim to have defeated Ronan on Expert, but I was never able to do it, at least not reliably. I don't think that she is that caliber of hero, though I would be happy if someone pointed me in the direction of a video showing her do that. For me, she goes in the A tier along with Captain America, and probably that will be controversial for some players who will believe that she deserves to be higher. I don't think many players will think she deserves to be lower. There will also be players who think the same of Captain America. But in my opinion, the defensive specialists are limited in what they can do against really difficult content because of their lack of burst damage or damage that can go around Retaliate. And you get a little from things like Flow Like Water or Electrostatic Armor, but you have to hang around for a long time in order for those little pings of 1 damage to add up to something that defeats the villain. And the defensive specialists are stable, but not that stable when you're trying to kind of maximize the difficulty that you can play on. So I'm comfortable with them in the A tier. At least I know that no one's going to buy them expecting them to be S tier and be disappointed. The S plus tier and the S tier heroes that we have are ones that I am very confident in. And Ghost Spider, Captain America, you could make an argument for like A plus, but I'm comfortable with them in the A tier. Next up we have Miles Morales. Spider-Man Miles Morales. Decent stats and very strong events. Nearly no resource generation, but very strong events in the right circumstances. And what are those circumstances? Well, He's got Swing In, which removes 4 threat, and when you use it with Spider Camouflage, you also get a Confuse and a Toughness. When you can make use of that, that's very good value. And then he's got his Venom, or his Web Shot, which deals 4 damage and then also activates Venom Blast, which deals an additional 2 and a stun. And 6 damage and a stun for 2 is pretty good. Now, what scenario is that not that good against? Well, it's not that good against Steady or Stalwart. And there are a few pretty hard villains that have Steady and Stalwart. Against Steady or Stalwart, these events end up being kind of low value. And Arachnobatics relies on an enemy being confused and or stunned in order to reach its full potential. 1 cost for 2 damage isn't that good. In fact, it's not good at all. If you can get a stun on the enemy, then you can do 1 cost for 5 damage, which is pretty decent. And if you can do 1 cost for 8 damage, that's exceptional if the enemy has confused as well. And if the enemy has Steady, you can still do that. In fact, it's easier to do that against an enemy with Steady. Against an enemy with Stalwart, though, you can't do it at all. So his effectiveness is reduced against enemies with Steady. It's reduced a lot against enemies with Stalwart, and he doesn't have any resource generation to speak of, except for Web Shooter, so he ends up generating fewer resources than Peter Parker does. Nonetheless, there's a lot that he can do, and he's going in the A tier along with Ghost Spider and Captain America. Thanks to his strong events, he's got some pretty cool rushdown strategies available to him. But he's not good enough to get beyond the A tier because of that reliance on Stun and Confuse, and because of the lack of decent resource generation, in my opinion. First hero released after the Sinister Motives expansion was Nova. Nova I like a lot. This hero is a lot of fun. After you use one of Nova's basic powers, ready Supernova Helmet. Supernova Helmet you can grab from the deck using his Alter Ego action to start the game. And then Supernova Helmet generates a wild resource, and then when you use Nova's basic power, then you can ready Supernova Helmet and use it again for another wild resource. When you combine this with Unleash the Nova Force, card which allows you to ready up and draw a card anytime you defeat an enemy, Nova defeats an enemy or removes the last threat from a scheme, you can have some pretty big turns, some mega turns. That's what we're looking for. Now, Nova can't fulfill the second condition. His burst damage isn't good. His damage that gets around Retaliate isn't good. He struggles in that regard because I think his highest damage is like 4. His highest damage event is 4, and that's really low. And his stats aren't good. But he is able to overcome his stats to a certain extent and accomplish a lot, given how low his stats are. And so he's going in the S tier. He is actually capable of taking on one of the big 3 villains, at least one. And that would be, I think, Magneto, if my memory serves. He's able to take on Magneto on expert difficulty. He's really good, and he's really fun. I have no trouble recommending him as a hero that defeats a lot of content. He is kind of on the harder to play end of the scale, but he's really, really strong. And he's going in the S tier because he can take on so much of the content, including at least one of the 3 hardest villains in the game. So these heroes that we got right now, S plus and S, these are all heroes I'm very comfortable recommending. In particular the S plus ones, of course, but if you don't care if a hero can take on all of the content in the game and you just want someone who can take on most of it, the S tier heroes will do very well for you as well. The most budget friendly hero of these kind of top 6 right now is Iron Man, who's relatively cheap to build out if you're just looking for a deck to play in a multiplayer comp where you can make strong contributions. Nova's really, really good and really fun to play. I like Nova a lot, and I was able to get a lot of stuff done with him. One last card to note with Nova, which is a card that's of a type that's unique to Nova. Resource cards aren't unique, but this one doesn't count toward your hand size. So when you draw it, you can draw 1 additional card, and that also helps set up some big turns. Next up we have Ironheart. Ironheart starts relatively weak, but still pretty good with 1, 2, 3 stats, but she has hand size 4, but she's able to overcome that because when you upgrade her, she gets hand size 5, and when you upgrade her again, she gets to hand size 6. Ironheart is incredible, and the key to Ironheart is this. She doesn't have burst damage in her cards, but when you generate progress counters and you're already at phase 3, they can be used to deal 2 damage to an enemy. And you note 2 things about this that are very important to understanding Ironheart's strength. And number 1, this isn't labeled as an attack, so it doesn't proc retaliate. Number 2, there's no limit to the amount of progress counters that can be on her. There's also no limit to the number that you can spend in one turn. So what you do with Ironheart is you get set up while you're in stage 2 against a villain. You get set up, you move from phase 1 or from version 1 to version 2 of Ironheart, from version 2 to version 3, and then you just build up progress counters until you have 10 or 11. And then you move the villain into stage 3, and you spend all of your progress counters and you OTK the villain. Which means with any villain in the game, as long as you don't do something stupid, you can OTK it. And therefore all you have to worry about is getting through Ironheart's weak early game. To help with that, I recommend playing Ironheart Justice with the card One Way or Another. If you don't have One Way or Another, there's little point to playing her Justice, but with One Way or Another, it helps her to draw those cards early that she needs to get her setup going, her progress counters, so that she can switch to the version 2 and version 3. And I had great success with Ironheart using that deck. Ironheart is going in the S tier. I don't think her win rate is as high as Star-Lord or Doctor Strange's because she struggles in the early game. Sometimes to get out of phase 1 you need a good draw. But once you do, she can OTK any villain in the game on stage 3 because of those progress counters, as long as you just hang out in stage 2 and build them up. So Ironheart's going in the S plus tier. This cycle, the Sinister Motive cycle, probably my favorite cycle in the game. Definitely my favorite cycle in the game. I really like that cycle. With Nova, Ironheart, Ghost Spider, Miles Morales, these are all very strong heroes. Very, very strong. I know that I read that the developers made the first 20 heroes like all at once, and they had those kind of ready to go very early in the game's life, and I think Vision was the 20th, and there seems to be a marked difference in heroes released after that. They were more powerful than the average ones that we saw coming before, though of course Doctor Strange and Star-Lord being exceptions, but exceptions were kind of few and far between before the Sinister Motive cycle. And then after that we started getting some more powerful heroes, at least for one cycle. The X-Men cycle was okay. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but the Sinister Motive cycle I really liked. The Web Warrior cards, really liked. So, Ironheart, S plus tier. Because of the ability to get around that retaliate damage and the ability to build up those progress counters and then basically just skip stage 3 of any villain that you want to. Spider-Ham is our next hero. Up until the Ironheart hero pack, we had only 3 S plus tier heroes. Now we've got 2 back-to-back, Ironheart and then Spider-Ham. Spider-Ham is incredible. He is my pick for best hero in the game. And the reason? Each tune counter on Spider-Ham can be spent as if it were a wild resource. After he takes any amount of damage, place 1 tune counter on him, which means he feeds on Retaliate. Every time he takes Retaliate damage, it generates another tune counter. He also has this ability to heal for 5 and generate a tune counter when you heal. And then his kit is also very strong. Not every card is a winner, but Petulant Pig is. The villain attacks you, draw 3 cards. Swinging Web Pig allows you 6 damage and a confuse. Cartoon Physics allows you to prevent all but 1 damage from an attack. Well, from any amount of damage, doesn't have to be from an attack. And you got huge wooden hammer for plus attack, organic webbing for +1 thwart, and he can ready himself and he can gain aerial. He's really, really strong. He's the only hero in True Solo that I would say has a win rate against the top 3 most difficult scenarios of greater than 50%. I think it might be around 50% against Venom Goblin, but it's over that against Ronin and Magneto. I haven't tested that. It's just my feeling. I had the highest win rate, the easiest time defeating the scenarios that I played with Spider-Ham, more so than any other hero. He's my pick for best hero in the game. I know a lot of players feel that it's Doctor Strange, but Spider-Ham just has these incredible turns. He doesn't have burst damage, and he doesn't really care. Now, one note, you need, in my opinion, to take full advantage of Spider-Ham, Clarity of Purpose. Clarity of Purpose deals you 1 damage to generate a wild resource, but with Spider-Ham that means it deals 2 resources because dealing the damage generates him another resource. And Clarity of Purpose only costs 1. It's incredibly efficient and is a necessity for playing Spider-Ham and getting the most out of him. And unfortunately that comes in the SPDR hero pack and not the Spider-Ham hero pack, but SPDR is fun in her own right. Anyway, Spider-Ham, my pick for best hero in the game. Hero that I had the easiest time defeating content with. And so I think he's really, really strong. Doctor Strange and Star-Lord aren't that far behind him, but in my opinion they are behind him, even in spite of his relatively weak stats. He just generates so many resources. And that heal to get you out of trouble. He's really the only hero in the game that I don't mind flipping to alter ego with nearly at will. Because 5 recovery and 1 resource is very good value when you're in alter ego. And the last hero of the Sinister Motive cycle is SPDR. SPDR is a very unique hero that I like a lot. SPDR has a hand size of only 3, while in hero mode, Penny Parker has a hand size of 4, but she does have an alter ego action of exhausting the suit. So this hero has 2 cards that start on the board, Penny Parker and the SPDR suit, and they both have a side to them and they both flip together. Essentially what it means is that you can either draw 2 cards in a turn or you can exhaust the suit when you're in hero form to generate a resource. Most players are going to choose to draw 2 cards. Is that enough to make up for the weak hand size when you're in alter ego form? Yeah, it is. When you're not, well, to make up for that hand size of 3, you can exhaust an interface upgrade you control to generate that upgrade's resources. You at least always have SPDR to do that with. Then you have, or the SPDR suit. Then you have a variety of other upgrades that you can use to either generate resources or they have their own abilities. Web Trap gives you a 5 damage with a stun. To make up for that, help make up for that 3 hand size, you have Ant-Man, Uncle Ben. You can discard the top 2 of your deck and add each SPDR card discarded to your hand. It's card draw, it's not super reliable. SPDR command, you can exhaust it and an interface upgrade to draw a card. That's good. It's a benefit. It's not a slam dunk benefit, but it's a benefit. And then you have your upgrades, which you can use to ready SPDR, or add thwart, attack, or defense, or you can use them to generate a resource. Is all of this enough to overcome her hand size of 3? Yeah, it is. It's not enough to get her to the S tier, but it's enough that you can get a lot done with her, a lot more than I expected. She's going in the A tier. She's going kind of low down the A tier, and she's pretty complicated to play, but given that you do get Clarity of Purpose with the SPDR hero pack, and that's an essential card for Spider-Ham, a lot of players are going to buy this hero and discover that you get a pretty decent hero. She's the only hero in the game, in my opinion, with a hand size of 4 or less that belongs anywhere other than the D tier or worse. So this is a good example of a hero that has a low hand size, but you can still make her work. And I like this hero. There's a lot of decisions to be made when you play SPDR, and that's what I like about her. Gives you a lot of decisions. Now, the relatively weak strength of the events does hold her back. If she had stronger events, she could do better, but she doesn't, and that's because of, I think, the unique resource generation system. They didn't want to accidentally make her OP. That as a result, she's good. She's very good. Definitely, at least in my opinion, belongs in the A tier because of the success that I was able to have with her against some pretty difficult scenarios. But I wouldn't expect her to take on the hardest scenarios in the game. So we're into the most recent cycle of Marvel Champions, which is the Mutant Genesis cycle. If you're curious about the best possible team of Web Warriors, well, there's actually only one possible team of all Web Warriors. That's Spider-Ham, along with Ghost Spider, SPDR, and Miles Morales. That's the only possible team if you want to play all Web Warriors. And it's a pretty good team. It's a pretty good team. It's probably better than the Guardians team on average. Anyway, let's take a look at the X-Men heroes. The Mutant Genesis cycle is all X-Men heroes. And the first of the two that come in the Mutant Genesis expansion is Colossus. Unfortunately, a hand size 4 hero. He revolves around tough status cards. When you change to this form, give Colossus a tough status card, and that's another unfortunate thing about the hero, is that they want to encourage you to flip to Alter Ego and back, which is not good in true solo. You do get to start with Organic Steel as part of your setup, and Organic Steel allows you to replace tough status cards as you lose them twice, and then the card is done. Colossus has Titanium Muscles, which you can exhaust to generate a strength resource for each tough status card on Colossus. But if you had 2 tough status cards on Colossus, you would still only get up to basically where the average C tier hero is in terms of resource generation, and he doesn't have any ways to draw cards. For his damage, he's got Steel Fist, which deals 5, and you can discard a tough status card to stun and confuse an enemy. And he's got Made of Rage. When you make a basic attack, discard a tough status card to get +6. Even if these cards didn't require you to discard a tough status card, they wouldn't be that good, and they probably shouldn't require you to if you're going to have a hand size of 4, because a hand size of 4 is a large handicap to overcome. But this isn't the situation, and these cards do have these requirements, and I wouldn't say they'd be that good if they didn't. So overall, we're looking at a D tier hero, which is typically the case at best for a hand size 4 hero. The only exception that I've seen so far being SPDR. So Colossus definitely on the weaker side, which is too bad because I really like the character, and the tough status card mechanic is very interesting. But we've seen very consistently that any hero whose powers appear to be strength-based in the MCU or in the comics, that would be Thor, Drax, Colossus, Hulk, and She-Hulk, all of them hand size 4. I don't see a single kind of strength power-based hero that doesn't have a hand size of 4, and I'm not sure if that's for thematic reasons or not, but unfortunately it makes the strength-based heroes not very playable, at least not in true solo. Thor is probably the most playable thanks to Asgard and thanks to his ability to draw 2 cards when a minion enters play. But the rest really just aren't very good. I'd probably rank Colossus above Drax, something like that. But he's definitely on the weaker side. Next up we have Shadowcat. Shadowcat is very interesting because Shadowcat has two different forms. She has solid form, which generates a resource for an attack or defense event. And she has phased form, and when you're defending in phased form, you cannot take damage. Now, when Shadowcat is defending, it means either you exhaust her to defend, like normal, or you use a card that is labeled defense, a card such as Quick Shift, which is labeled defense. So if you use Quick Shift while you're in phased form, you draw 2 cards. It counts as defending, and you don't need to exhaust Shadowcat, and then she's guaranteed to take no damage from the attack. So she's a defensive specialist, to say the least. And the issues with her are, well, there's multiple issues. So first of all, I will say that my opinion on Shadowcat is likely to be a little controversial with some players, because I've seen on Marvel CDP a deck list which says that it defeats Ronin on Expert. My experience with Shadowcat was that she doesn't really get close to that. So here's the issues with Shadowcat. First, she only has Quick Shift to draw cards. She can generate a resource with her solid phase, but it can only be used for an attack or defense event, so it's not very useful for it's not useful at all for getting rid of enemy attachments. But she does have some tools, or a tool to do that. She has Phase Strike, which deals 6 damage, and if you're in phased mass form, you may discard an attachment with the text Hero Action or Hero Response. But that brings me to one of the issues with her, which is that there isn't a lot of burst damage here. So you have to do a lot of sustained damage over time. The other issue is that she's got a few different dead cards in her kit, or cards that I would consider so niche that I almost never want to play them. In true solo, the first of which would be Acute Control, a 1-cost upgrade after you ignore the guard or patrol keyword on a minion. Exhaust Acute Control to deal 2 damage to that minion. So one of the ideas around this hero is that she has this ability while you're phased to ignore guard and patrol on any crisis icons. That gives her versatility. Well, if you've been following my videos or just watching all of this video, you'll know that typically in card games, or in this game in particular, when you have a hero that's versatile, often they're not very powerful. Shadowcat only has 9 hit points. Her stats are good, but the power on her events is not very good, the overall amount of damage done. And that would be because she is versatile. She has the ability to ignore guard, patrol, and crisis icons. The issue with that is that there aren't actually that many situations where you want to do that, or where you need to. Most of the time, especially in true solo, you're just wanting to clear the board. You don't care if you have the option of ignoring guard or patrol, because you want to clear those minions anyway. You don't want to leave them on the table or you'll get overwhelmed. Since we're clearing them anyway, we don't find ourselves in that many situations where we actually want or need to ignore guard or patrol, which means this card just isn't really that useful. And the deal 2 damage, maybe in a game you ignore guard or patrol once, maybe twice. If you could ignore it twice, this is decent, but it just doesn't happen that much. So I almost never play this card when I'm playing Shadowcat. Intangible Interference, I kind of feel the same way. After you ignore the crisis icon on a scheme, that just doesn't happen that much. How often do you even see a scheme come out with the crisis icon? It's like once per game, maybe? So these cards just are kind of dead. They're not that good, just because their use case is too limited. And the other damage event that Shadowcat had is Shadowcat Surprise, which only deals 3. So you've got a 5 damage event and a 3 damage event, which means you have to do a lot of different sources of damage to down a villain, and that means exposing yourself to retaliate a lot. Now, the deck that I saw that claimed to beat Ronin on Expert utilizes Flow Like Water and Electrostatic Armor, and those are good cards. They only deal 1 damage at a time, though, so it would take a long time. 10 attacks in Stage 3 to down the boss using those cards alone. You could combine it with damage from allies or damage from other sources, but it's really inefficient to do that, and Shadowcat, because the Retaliate will deal 2 damage to your allies instead of the normal 1 that you get from attacking. And if Shadowcat is taking the damage from Retaliate, she only has 9 HP, and she can't take that much of it before she needs to heal. So, I didn't find much success with Shadowcat against very difficult scenarios. And For me, she goes in the high C tier or maybe the low B tier. I'll put her in the low B tier. But I don't think that she's that good for high difficulty content. Now, as a defensive specialist on a multiplayer team, I probably would put her in like the C plus tier, to be honest, because typically for a hero to be higher than B, they at least have to be able to beat Rhino on Heroic 1, and I wasn't able to do that consistently with Shadowcat. But she has got a role as a defensive specialist because she can defend without taking any damage, and that's really, really good. It's just the issue is actually dealing damage, but if she's paired with a teammate who can deal damage, that'll make her better. And that's kind of true of all the defensive specialists. Spider-Man, I would argue Venom, Ghost Spider, Captain America, Shadowcat, they all are very likely to get better in multiplayer because they're very strong defenders. And very strong defenders just aren't that good in true solo. When you're playing a very strong attacker, you can make up for the lack of defense with allies to block attacks for you. When you're playing a strong defender, you don't really have a way to make up for the lack of offense. Because the only really efficient offensive combo in the game from the aspects, in my opinion, is Dive Bomb honed to technique, and Shadowcat can't use that because she doesn't have access to the aerial trait. The other combos are just so-so. They tend to be 6 damage for 3 or something like that. 2 for 5. Not what we're looking for. And so it's very hard to make up for not having offense. You can make up for not having defense with allies. Like Star-Lord has only 1 defense and no real defensive abilities except for like Bad Boy. It doesn't matter. He's still S+. Spider-Ham has high HP. He's got cartoon physics. But yeah, he's not an exceptional defender, I wouldn't say, but he's S+, possibly the best hero in the game. You can make up for not having great defense with a leadership deck. You can't really make up for not having good offense, and Shadowcat doesn't. And the reason that she doesn't is because her kit has versatility. And versatility at the expense of power isn't very good in true solo, but she is a lot of fun to play. I really like her. And in a multiplayer team, I think she would do very well as a defensive specialist. She's just not that good for true solo, in my opinion. Likely to be controversial, so if anybody knows of a link to a YouTube video of Shadowcat defeating Ronan on Expert, I would absolutely love to see it. And please post it in the comments. And I will happily admit that I was wrong about her. Next up we have Cyclops. Cyclops is interesting. Cyclops has a deck building gimmick. You may include X-Men allies from any aspect in your deck, which means he can make a pretty good Uncanny X-Men deck if you've bought most, if not all, of the X-Men hero packs. Uncanny X-Men comes in the Storm Hero pack. Cyclops has 2/1/2 stats, deals 3 damage at the cost of 1 resource. Okay. But only if an enemy has an upgrade attached. So Cyclops has Ruby Quartz Visor for resource generation, but you can only generate a lightning resource for your Optic Blast ability. Doesn't have any abilities or card draw beyond that. So he's got this ability, Field Commander. You take the first turn during the player phase. Each Cyclops upgrade attached to a minion loses the temporary keyword. This does very little in multiplayer. So this cycle is not very good for true solo. It was clearly, very clearly, more so than any other cycle, designed for multiplayer. And there are multiple heroes that you can point to make the case for that. And the X-Men are a team. I don't have any issue with them being designed for true solo for thematic purposes. The issue is a playability issue. And the playability issue leaves players feeling, who are true solo players, feeling, I think, a little bit disconnected, a little bit left out. in some cases when you have heroes that are so clearly designed for multiplayer that they are partially non-functional in solo. So I would say this card is not really worth playing in true solo. 1 cost upgrade just to have your upgrades lose the temporary keyword on minions isn't that good. Now if you could have it lose the temporary keyword on villains, that would be something. And that is actually a change I would prefer for Cyclops. I would prefer that the upgrades not be temporary. But that's speaking from a true solo perspective. He would be much more playable in true solo. He really wouldn't be that good, or he might be incredibly overpowered in multiplayer though. He really wouldn't be that good in true solo. He'd go up to like an A, maybe an S, but he wouldn't be S plus because of his lack of resource draw or card draw, resource generation or card draw. But he might be incredibly overpowered in multiplayer if his attachments were permanent. So I get it. His attachments will typically reduce damage, increase damage that you deal, reduce damage that the enemy deals, or draw cards when you defeat them. Drawing cards is great. I mentioned he doesn't have any card draw. He does have priority target. It's hard to get off because you don't always have a minion that you can use this on. So very inconsistent, but he does have a little bit of card draw. And then his damage, he's got Ricochet Beam, which deals 3 and 3. Unfortunately, that will proc Retaliate twice. And then he's got Full Blast. When you use your Optic Blast ability, you can exhaust Cyclops, and this attack deals 8 additional damage, which is great. It's efficient. It does require that you have an attachment out on the enemy so that you can use Optic Blast, and it requires that you exhaust Cyclops, so you can't use Cyclops to attack, but you can get the 8 additional damage and overkill. Overall, what Cyclops can do is mainly tied to his ability to include X-Men from any aspect in the deck. And combined with Uncanny X-Men, which provides significant cost reduction of 1 on each X-Men ally, that's actually enough to elevate Cyclops into the B tier. He's not bad. There's some things he can do thanks to Uncanny X-Men and his ability to make full use of it. He does that better than any other X-Men ally because there are like 1 or 2 decent X-Men allies from each aspect, but not really enough to build an all X-Men deck unless you have access to all of the X-Men allies, and only Cyclops does. So I would say he builds the best Uncanny X-Men deck, and he's really the only hero that I would build an Uncanny X-Men deck with, and that's a lot of fun. I like it. I enjoy Cyclops. I wish that his upgrades weren't temporary for a true solo. But I get the reasoning when it comes to multiplayer, and this is a very, very multiplayer-centered cycle. Important to keep that in mind for players that are looking at buying content from this cycle. Next up we have Phoenix, Jean Grey. She begins with 4 power counters on her. She's got this restrained, unleashed side representing the Phoenix Force being unleashed. Starts with 4 power counters on it. Each of those can be spent to generate a wild resource once per phase. She has 3 thwart, which is the highest in the game, 1 attack and 2 defense. But apart from these 4 power counters, she really struggles to generate resources. That's a common theme with all of the X-Men allies. And once she unleashes, she gets -2 thwart and +2 attack. Her events are interesting. She has Rise from the Ashes, which is a pretty good defensive card. She's got Telekinetic Shield, which is an okay defensive card. She's got Mental Paralysis, which can disable a non-elite minion. And then she's got Mind Control, which is one of the most fun cards in the game, where you can take control of an attached minion and treat it as a controlled ally with a blank text box with its thwart equal to its scheme, and it takes 1 consequential damage after it thwarts or attacks. It's one of the most fun cards in the game. It's not enough to elevate Phoenix, so you can also deal 7 damage to an enemy. If you have Unleashed, you deal 2 additional and gain overkill. 9 damage for 3 is pretty decent. If Phoenix had more ways to generate resources or draw cards, she would be pretty good, at least B tier, though she does have a significant downside. And that downside is her nemesis. Her nemesis, Dark Phoenix, is the worst in the game in my opinion. 12 HP, 2 scheme, 2 attack, steady, toughness, villainous. When she schemes, place that threat on Consume the World. When revealed, search for Consume the World and reveal it. Consume the World is a side scheme. And after threat it's permanent. You can't get rid of it. And after threat is placed here, if there's at least 12 threat, the players lose the game. Straight up, so it gives the enemy an additional victory condition. Basically, when you flip to Unleashed, this is a ticking time bomb where if the game goes on long enough, you'll get her nemesis, and if you can't deal the 12 HP relatively quickly, you're going to lose. This drops Phoenix from likely a B tier hero down into the C tier, with no resource generation to speak of, or I would say anemic resource generation, because she can get an additional 1 per round for the first 4 rounds or so. But after that, it's pretty anemic, which is similar to all of the X-Men heroes for the most part. When you combine those factors, I would say this is a pretty average hero, C tier. Her mind control is a lot of fun though, but not enough for me to recommend this hero on the basis of her power alone. It would have to be for fun or thematic reasons to pick up Phoenix. Next up we have Wolverine. Wolverine is very interesting. Wolverine is, in my opinion, the best of the X-Men heroes. Wolverine heals for 6. He starts with his claws in play, which you can use to exhaust. You can exhaust the claws, choose an attack event and take damage equal to its cost, and then play that event for free. This is very good cost reduction. In terms of his resource generation / card draw, he doesn't have a way to deal with boss attachments very well, because you can't use this cost reduction to do that. You can only use it for this narrow focus, which is an attack event. So Wolverine is what I would call, I think it's pretty safe to say, he's an offense specialist. He has the ability to heal for 2 damage, which is nice, but really just restores the HP from his claw attacks. He's not that good at defense, really. But because he can play attack events for free if you have the HP, he's very, very good at offense. Now, for card draw, he does have Berserker Frenzy, so he's not completely devoid of it. After he takes any amount of damage from an enemy attack, you can draw a card. So I actually like to keep minions on the table sometimes to attack Wolverine for 1, so that you draw a card, because that's worth it. But after you flip to Alter Ego, you discard this card. It's only 1 card in a 40-card deck. It's not the easiest to keep around, but it is pretty essential to beating some hard, very difficult scenarios. His attacks are not that efficient when it comes to events, so he pays for being able to pay for them with health by, well, I wouldn't say it's a huge cost. 8 damage for 3 is still pretty good. The other one at 6 damage for 3, and you take 2 retaliate if the boss has retaliate, is not that great. But lunging strike is very good, and a lot of the victories will revolve around timely lunging strikes. Wolverine's going in the A tier. I didn't have enough success with him to put him in the S tier or the A+ tier. And I think the reason is that he has too narrow of a focus on his cost reduction. It's all offense, and the offense isn't quite efficient enough to make up for the lack of card draw. So when we look at the heroes that really generate resources well, that are in the S+ or S tier, Spider-Hams is built into the hero. Doctor Strange is in the Invocation deck. It's not part of the 40 card deck. Star-Lord's has some built into the hero, and then he also has his helmet. Ironheart built into the hero as long as you upgrade her. Vision, he's unique. He's got Bring It, which draws 10 or 11 cards. Not built into the hero, but compensates you by drawing a massive amount of cards. Ant-Man doesn't have it built into the hero. He needs Ant-Man's helmet. But he does have a lot of damage in the Army of Ants that is immune to retaliate. Captain Marvel built into the hero with her alter ego ability, and then she just does massive burst damage. And Nova, semi built into the hero with Supernova helmet. Wolverine does have the cost reduction built into the hero, but its focus is narrower than any of the other heroes that are above him. So Venom has it built into the hero, Spider-Man has it built into the hero, Iron Man has it built into the hero, and in each of these cases it's card draw for Iron Man and Spider-Man, wild resource for Venom, wild resource for Nova, card draw for Captain Marvel, plus burst damage, immune to retaliate damage for Ant-Man, wild resource, card draw / wild resources as well. Any cost reduction that can be used on any hero in the case of Star-Lord. Ironheart, card draw, Vision, card draw. So that's really what we're looking for the S-, A+, or S or S+ tiers. And we're not looking for necessarily resource generation with a narrower focus. Though that is certainly quite good in this situation, and definitely enough to get Wolverine up to the A tier, maybe even the high A tier. But my opinion is that he shouldn't go any higher than that. And that may be controversial because I have seen a Reddit post asking who is better, Doctor Strange or Wolverine, and most of the responders said Doctor Strange, and some said it wasn't that close, but there are one or two that said Wolverine. And I kind of understand that because Wolverine does absolutely shred standard difficulty. And I'm sure he's an amazing offensive specialist for a multiplayer team. But in true solo, he lacks the ability to have monster turns, meaning turns that set you up for future turns. So it seems like his cost reduction is really good. Like, okay, you can play a 3 cost attack or even a 4 cost attack for essentially free if you have the HP to pay for it. So therefore, how can you say this hero isn't S tier? Well, what we're looking for when we're playing on really high difficulty, we're looking to use stage 2 of the villain to set up stage 3. Which means during stage 2, we'd like to be able to get out cards like Avengers Mansion, like the X-Jet, or Adamantium Skeleton, a card that comes in Wolverine's kit, and so forth, so that we have more power available to us when we enter stage 3. Wolverine's cost reduction doesn't assist with that. Wolverine's cost reduction has a narrow focus, and that focus is offense only. You can't use his cost reduction to help you get out Avengers Mansion. You can't use his cost reduction to help you get out Helicarrier or anything like that. And so you can't set yourself up for the future using his cost reduction. If you want to set yourself up for the future, you have to do so using the standard 5 resources that you get each round, or more if you have Berserker Frenzy out. Now, he does have this card called Track by Scent, which is really good. Removes 3 threat from a scheme, and if this removes the last threat from that scheme, draw 2 cards. This is the reason why he's high A tier, and he's borderline go in the next tier. But again, every hero that we looked at, that I mentioned just now, that's above Wolverine, has their wild resource generation or their card draw built into the hero. And so when we have heroes that have decent card draw abilities, but they're not built into the hero, well, with the exception of Ant-Man and Captain Marvel, but I mentioned their incredible burst damage for Captain Marvel, or Ant-Man's immune to retaliate damage. But with those exceptions, if it's not built into the hero, it's not enough to elevate them to a very high tier. It's enough to get them out of the doldrums, certainly, and into the A tier, which is very strong. There's a large amount of content that Wolverine will do. A large amount. And in my attempts on Ronin, I'd say he's certainly capable of it, but not at a high enough win rate to put him into the S tier. I played around 10 games against Ronan and came close maybe once or twice, but enough to make me think he can do this, just it's not going to happen that often. So that's why he's in the A tier for me. His cost reduction is good, but it's narrow focus. And the heroes that are above him typically have a wider focus on their cost reduction, or in the case of Captain Marvel, more burst damage than Wolverine has. He tops out at 8. Captain Marvel tops out at 10. And Ant-Man has the immune to retaliate factor, as well as healing built into his kit, which Wolverine also has. But it's really, I think, the immune to retaliate damage that separates Ant-Man. And then his helmet is also very good, even though it's not built into his kit. Anyway, that's Wolverine. Likely that players will disagree about where I placed him, but hopefully you'll understand my reasoning. And once again, if you do have a video link to Wolverine taking on Magneto, Venom Goblin, or Ronan on expert difficulty, I would absolutely love to see it. Every single hero that I tested, I always hoped that they would be good. I always hoped that they would be going in the S+ tier, and I did my best to get them there. And I was always disappointed anytime that didn't happen, and I was always disappointed anytime I played a hero who did worse than I wanted, because I would love if there were maybe 10 heroes in the S+ tier. Give or take, maybe like 8 to 10. That would be perfect for me in terms of variety. And I would absolutely love to be finding decks that are able to do Heroic 1 scenarios that weren't possible before, or even Heroic 2. But there are so few really strong heroes in the game that progression for me past a certain point has been limited, but at least we found some that can do all of the content on expert. So, moving on. We have Storm. Storm would be another hero that I would say is very multiplayer centered. Storm has a weather deck, and the weathered cards can be swapped out by Storm once per round with her hero ability. She does have very weak stats at 1-1. And we've mentioned before how difficult it is to overcome weak stats. You can draw a card with clear skies. Each character gains Stalwart. Now, that's going to include the villain and any characters that you have on your side. So, when you look at all of the cards, each character gains Retaliate, Special, Remove 2 Threat. Each character gets +1 attack. Each character gets -1 attack. You can see why this would be multiplayer centered, because if you swap to the right Storm cards, you can give your team huge advantages or inadvertently huge disadvantages with your cards. Like, for example, if you did all of your attacking, if you were the last player to go for your team, you did all of your attacking, and then you left the weather card as Thunderstorm, then for the villain's turn, he's going to have +1 attack along with his minions against your team, and that's not going to be good. Each character gains Retaliate. This is something you want for your team on the villain's turn, not something you want when you are attacking. Clear skies, each character gains Stalwart. Really depends on the situation. And then you also have chosen, or each character gets -1 attack. It's definitely something you want for the villain's turn, and something you don't want for the hero turn. So depending on how well you manage the weather deck, you can give your entire team benefits or disadvantages. And the reason I say this is a multiplayer centered hero, clearly something like each character gets +1 attack is way better with more friendly characters on the table if you're taking advantage of this. If you have 4 heroes, that's 4 characters getting +1 attack, as opposed to just one hero, which is just one character getting +1 attack. This makes your cards that revolve around changing forms, or just the weather deck in general, far more efficient than it is in true solo, which means Storm scales up in terms of how good she is based on the number of players in the game. In true solo, I did not find her very good at all. She does have this one resource generator, but that's about it, and she doesn't really deal much damage in terms of burst damage. And so she's got 8. 8 damage is not bad, and you can resolve the thunderstorm for another 2. But again, similar to Phoenix, this isn't enough when you factor in the anemic resource generation and the non-existent card draw, except if you use that one weather card that draws a card, but you can't do that every turn reliably. And if you do it every opportunity that you have, then you can't take advantage of her other weather cards as much. So I found Storm unwieldy and difficult to play in solo player, but she scales up for every player that you add into the game, and so I think she's likely to be pretty good in multiplayer. She's going in the C tier along with almost every other weak stat character that we've seen so far, or character that generates an anemic amount of resources. But I don't think this is really fair to Storm, because I think in multiplayer she'd be a lot of fun and much better than she is in solo. But this tier list is primarily for solo play, and so I gotta put Storm in the C tier. Next up we have Gambit. Gambit with his 3 defense, 2 attack, 1 thwart, pretty strong. You can place 1 charge counter on him once per round, and then you can remove the charge counters to give your events +1 damage. If you're using an event with multiple attacks built in, that's +1 to each of them, which makes Gambit a very good offensive specialist. I would argue competes with Wolverine for best offensive specialist in the game. His thwarting is interesting. He can thwart in Alter Ego by looking at the top 2. Using Thief Extraordinary, he can look at the top 2 cards of the encounter deck, discard 1, remove threat from a scheme equal to the number of boost icons. Pretty inconsistent way to thwart, and his thwarting is pretty weak otherwise. I would actually prefer that this ability not force you to exhaust Remy. I think he might get up to the S tier if that were the case. But unfortunately, it does. And when you do that, you can also use Thieves Guild if you have it on the table. That can let you draw a card. And other than that, he doesn't have any way to generate resources or draw cards. He's got Creole Charmer, which is pretty good. But because of the way his charge counters work with events, if you play Gambit as like aggression in a multiplayer comp and you're the offense specialist, you play aggression with like honed aspect and melee, you can do some pretty hilarious things. I think in my playtest I downed bosses with like these crazy 10 or 20 damage melees or something like that. 10 damage per instance of it when you get out honed aggression, because you can take melee from 3 and 3 up to like 9 and 9 or something like that. And if you spend the aggression card that increases damage even further, the resource card, you can get up to like 10 and 10 for a 20 damage melee, which is hilarious. You do need a little time to set that up, so it's not that good in multiplayer. If your teammates could cover you while you get set up, then he can do some really hilarious things. I like Gambit a lot for multiplayer. I think he's really, really good in multiplayer. In solo, he's hampered by a couple of different things. Resources and card draw. Just going over that over and over and over, and it probably will get a little tiresome, but it is really, really important in solo. So he's hampered by that, as are all of the X-Men, really. He's hampered by his thwarting, which is really inconsistent. And as I've mentioned before, we really don't want to be forced to flip to Alter Ego in solo, but Gambit is. Nonetheless, he's going in the A tier. And you could debate about which is better, Gambit or Wolverine, as an offensive specialist for a team. Personally, I think Gambit is more fun, and because you can do some really funny things with him if you go just pure offense and you've got kind of a teammate to cover up his deficiencies. But in true solo, he's got his weaknesses. He's got fantastic strengths too, and I think in playtesting I defeated was it like Heroic 1 Crossbones in like 3 minutes or something with Gambit. It amounted to roughly 3 turns because of how good he can, or how fast he can blitz down villains sometimes. But if you run into a situation with a villain that really can't be blitzed down that effectively, Gambit can run out of steam due to the boss being able to build up resources that you can't deal with. Basically, when you're playing true solo with Gambit, you're racing. You're trying to down the boss before he downs you, and if the boss has some kind of defense against that, then Gambit doesn't do that well. There is a lot that he can do, but he does run out of steam because of his non-existent, really, resource generation or card draw, and his events aren't that efficient on their own. They really do need those charge counters, which means you can run into problems if you want to play two of them in a round. Like if you were trying to build up a big turn somehow, utilizing extra resources like the X-Jet or Avengers Mansion or something, and you wanted to play two Royal Flushes in the same turn, you really can't, because Royal Flush doesn't do anything without the charge counters. And so you can have like one big attack per turn, but not really two. And a lot of like OTK strategies that we've used require the ability to do two with a big turn, which Gambit can't really do. But as part of a multiplayer comp where he's the offense specialist, tons of fun and really strong. But he doesn't do enough to, in terms of the resources or the economy, to get into that S minus A plus tier or S or S plus. And that is going to bring us to Rogue. Rogue, another hero that was very clearly designed with multiplayer in mind first. Rogue revolves around this touched ability. Attach touch to another character. You gain each of that character's traits until the end of the round. Touched gives you an extra ability depending on what you attach it to. A minion, you get Overkill. Villain, you get Retaliate 1. Ally, you get Aerial. And Hero, you get Stalwart. But you can't attach touch to Rogue. She can't use touched on herself. So, if you're playing true solo, you can never use that aspect of her kit. You can never gain Stalwart. And in addition, you're going to be limited in terms of the traits that you can gain access to. So if we think about what you can actually do with those traits, let's say you were paired with a Web Warrior partner, and you knew you could reliably attach touched to your Web Warrior partner, and then you would gain Web Warrior. That would enable you to play a Web Warrior deck if you want to, and Web Warrior cards are very, very strong. Or you could give her the Mystic trait and get out Sorcerer Supreme. You could give her the Avengers trait. You could give her anything you can think of. There's a lot of possibilities, but those possibilities are very limited in solo, because you're limited to actually getting out the ally that you want and then attaching touch to the ally, rather than always knowing that you're going to have the friendly hero available to attach touch to, and then when you factor in that you're never going to be able to gain Stalwart, and that has some downside for other abilities as well, such as going Rogue, you can never do the card draw if you wanted to, or the Southern Cross also has card draw option. You'll never be able to do that either. So Rogue just very clearly wasn't designed with solo in mind, which is my opinion of the entire X-Men cycle. You can play the heroes solo, but they were very, very clearly designed with multiplayer in mind first. Nonetheless, the quality of Rogue's events, her reasonable stats, energy transfer is quite good, pretty high value. Bulletproof Bell is great. When an enemy with touched attached prevent all damage and gain a tough status card, that's very efficient. Superpower Adaptation is near useless in solo play. If touched is attached to a friendly character, search its owner's discard pile for an event. Add that event to your hand. That allows for some very interesting combos in multiplayer. Not that good in solo. It's okay, but not that good in solo, really. You really don't want to be attaching to friendly characters that much. But in multiplayer, allows for some very interesting combos combined with gaining friendly traits. So I really wouldn't recommend Rogue if you're playing solo, but I think she'd be a lot of fun in multiplayer. She's going in the B tier, because I actually was able to do some things with her against like Rhino on Heroic 1 at least, which is my baseline for a hero getting into the B tier or above, and Some of her events are pretty high quality. 6 damage and a stun is good. 3 threat and a confuse is good. It's not going to be that good against steady or stalwart, but energy transfer I found useful. Bulletproof bell is pretty good. So I was able to do enough to down the minimum. I'd consider her roughly equivalent in strength to like Nebula, but man, it feels like, well, those of us who play solo a lot, I had the wish that Rogue had been designed so that I could somehow take full advantage of her kit, even in solo, but it's just not the case. So I really, even though she's in B tier, I really can't recommend Rogue for anybody who plays true solo exclusively, but in multiplayer I think she'd be a lot of fun. So my opinion about the best overall X-Men team would likely be Cyclops, Gambit, Rogue, and then possibly Storm or possibly Shadowcat. That would be the team that I would want to run if you want to run all X-Men. And would that team be better or worse than the Web Warriors team? I think it'd be worse. Of the synergies that we've seen, Web Warriors, X-Men, and Guardians of the Galaxy, I think I like Web Warriors the best. Probably X-Men and Guardians of the Galaxy might be roughly equivalent after that, but we didn't get an S plus hero out of the X-Men cycle. Didn't get one out of cycle number 2, I believe it was. And we didn't get one out of the X-Men cycle. We got one out of all of the others. But because the X-Men were so focused on multiplayer, I think they ended up a little bit on the lackluster side for solo. Because in some cases they were focused on multiplayer at the expense of solo. So 3 heroes come to mind: Cyclops with his field leadership, Rogue with her touched, and Storm with her weather deck. They just really seem focused on multiplayer. And so I'd take that into account if you're thinking about buying them for solo play. You could have fun with Gambit or Wolverine. I wouldn't expect too much from them. But I think multiplayer is where the X-Men are really going to shine. So that's our tier list. That's all of the heroes that have currently been released as of August 12th, 2023. Any of the S Plus heroes I feel comfortable recommending for a solo player. They'll clear all of the content. It depends on your skill, of course, and how dedicated you are to making the best deck possible for them. But I could comfortably recommend any of them, provided you're willing to Bring It for Vision. And I could comfortably recommend the S tier heroes if you'd like to clear a lot of the content, but not all of them, not all of it, and are okay with some flaws. And then S minus A plus kind of similar. Going to be some flaws. They'll clear a lot, but definitely going to be some flaws. Anything below that, the A or B tier heroes are going to be above average for sure, and they're going to be fun. They're going to have some holes in their kit. And the C, D, or F I would consider for fun or thematic purposes. With the C tier heroes, nothing being particularly wrong with them. They're just kind of lacking in terms of their ability to draw or generate resources. And the D or F tier are the ones who have mechanics who either rely on you flipping to alter ego, an over-reliance on alter ego, I would say. So we'll look at the patterns of the list before we conclude the video. I've been doing that, but we'll do it in a little more depth now. So the F tier, these are heroes whose kits I would say are functionally broken. They just don't work. They don't feel good to play. They're not powerful. She-Hulk and Hulk with their 4 attack, and their kits are just, they got dead cards. They just aren't good. There's no way around it. They're broken. Not broken as in good, they're broken as in bad. Groot with his forced interrupt that removes your growth counters. Valkyrie with the death glow. They just don't function well. And I really can't recommend them for anyone. The D tier heroes, we have Rocket, Black Panther, Miss Marvel, Spectrum, and War Machine, who all, I would say, have an over-reliance on alter ego and or partially non-functional mechanics. Spectrum, I would say, has partially non-functional mechanics with the getting stuck in the energy form Rocket, Black Panther, Miss Marvel, and War Machine have an over-reliance on flipping to the alter ego, and when you can't do that, or you don't really want to because you really never want to in true solo, they're not very good, and that's why they are in the D tier. And then we have Thor, Colossus, and Drax that are in the D tier because of their 4 hand size, but would actually be pretty good if they didn't have that. In the C tier, we have heroes like Hawkeye, Spider-Woman, Wasp, Adam Warlock, Storm, Quicksilver. They all have weaker stats. Spider-Woman can buff up, not every single turn, but she can buff up her stats. Each of them also suffers from anemic resource generation. Typically, each of those characters can generate 1 resource and often only for a specific purpose. Then we have Gamora, Black Widow, Phoenix, and Shadowcat, who all have different stats, but again, all have pretty good stats. So they're in the upper part of the C tier, but again, they don't generate resources well, and their event power is nothing to speak of. Also true of the weaker statted heroes. None of these have burst damage events. Burst damage meaning events that go beyond 8 power for 3. Though Phoenix can do 9, which is why she's on the upper end of the C tier. Shadowcat being in the upper end of the C tier for her defensive specialist abilities. But that's why those heroes are in the C tier. Then the B tier heroes are getting better and they can do some things. And the A tier heroes are just Wolverine, Gambit, Ghost Spider, and Captain America. I would call specialists, exceptional specialists. With Spider-Man being like a stun/confused specialist, and SPDR being a very good hero hampered by a weak hand size. If she would have had 4 or 5 hand size, this would be an S+ tier hero, and I wish she had. I wish she did have 5 hand size. I wouldn't mind at all having a 6th hero added to the S+ tier. And SPDR would be that if she had 5 hand size and possibly with 4. But I think 5 would do it for sure, and I wish she did have that. But she doesn't, so she gets limited. It's like an S+ tier hero that was then knocked down to size with that hand size of 3. Then we have Venom, Spider-Man, Iron Man. These heroes generate resources really well and reliably. They have strong stats. Spider-Man has good defensive abilities. Venom has good defensive abilities. Iron Man has pretty good offensive abilities, and that's 7 hand size, but he's weak early. And the other 2 lack burst damage. And then we get into the S and S+ tier heroes. The S+ tier heroes, each of them generates resources really well. Each of them has access to a lot of power, either burst damage or the ability to ignore retaliate, or in Spider-Ham's ability, he can feed off of retaliate by generating resources anytime he takes retaliate damage, and he heals very well. So those are the reasons why I have each of these heroes in the position that I have them. And for players who see the video and are filled with rage that your favorite hero was placed too low, you can easily change my mind, and I would be happy to have my mind changed. Just provide a link in the comments to a video in which your favorite character downs either Magneto, Venom Goblin, or Ronin on expert difficulty, and I will be happy to change my mind, because I would absolutely love if there were more powerful heroes in the game. And if I simply missed something about a hero, missed a deck that's available to them, missed a playstyle that makes them more powerful, I will be very happy to hear about it. And I hope that I do. But for now, this is where I've got all the heroes in terms of their power levels. And thank you for watching.